Section 1. Before the beginning, the primordial void, soft wind through infinite spaces. Picture, if you will, a time before time itself had meaning, not darkness, for darkness requires light to define it, not silence, for silence needs sound to give it shape. This was the primordial state of existence before Japan's islands knew their form, before the sun learned her path across the sky, before the very concepts of earth and heaven had separated into their distinct realms. The ancient texts speak of this, beginning with reverent whispers. In the Kojiki, written down in 712 AD, though its stories reach back through countless generations of oral tradition, we find the words, "When heaven and earth began, 3 deities came into being in Takamagahara." But what was this Takamagahara, this high plane of heaven? Imagine a realm that exists everywhere and nowhere, a dimension of pure potential floating above the formless chaos below. The Japanese call this primordial state konton, a word that sounds like the hollow echo in an endless cave. It was neither solid nor liquid, neither hot nor cold. Ancient priests described it as resembling an ocean of clouds that had no surface and no depth, or like the inside of an egg before life stirs within it. If you could somehow stand at the edge of existence and peer into this void, you would see something like oil upon water, shapeless and shimmering, waiting for the first movement of creation to give it purpose. Then, as naturally as a flower blooms when its season arrives, the first consciousness emerged. This was Ame no Minaka, Nushi no Kami, whose name, when spoken slowly, means divine lord of the center of heaven. Try to comprehend a being that exists as pure awareness, without form, without substance, yet containing within itself all possibilities of existence. The loneliness of this first deity defies human understanding. Imagine waking to find yourself the only conscious thing in an infinite expanse of potential, with no other voice to hear, no other presence to acknowledge your existence. This cosmic loneliness would not last. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water, 2 more deities spontaneously manifested, Takami Musubi and Kami Musubi, the high creating deity and the divine creating deity. These 3 formed the Kotoamatsu Kami, the distinguished heavenly gods, beings so abstract and remote that they would never directly interact with the world that would come. They were forces rather than figures, principles rather than personalities. Listen carefully to how the ancient Japanese understood creation, not as a violent act of will, but as a gentle emergence, like bamboo shoots pressing through soft earth after spring rain. The universe was not commanded into being. It grew into being, layer upon layer, deity upon deity. After these 3 came the Kami-onna-nyo, the 7 divine generations. First appeared Kuni no Tokutachi, whose name means land eternal standing. Picture this deity as the first thought of solid ground in an existence that had known only formlessness. Next emerged Toyokumonu, resembling thick clouds gathering before they know they will become rain. These early deities came into being alone, without partners, and having fulfilled their role in the cosmic unfolding, they hid themselves, as the texts mysteriously state. What does it mean for a god to hide? Perhaps they became the hidden laws of nature itself, the invisible forces that would govern all creation. Gravity, time, the tendency of things to grow and change. Then the pattern shifted. The deities began appearing in pairs, male and female principles united. Uhijini and his spouse Suhijini represented mud and sand, the first materials of earth. Tsunuguhi and Ikuguhi embodied the complete and the growing. Otonoji and Otonobe brought the concepts of elder and younger, the passage of generations. With each divine generation, creation became more concrete, more specific, moving from abstract principle toward tangible reality. The sound of their names, when chanted in the old shrines, creates a rhythm like waves building toward shore, each one stronger and more defined than the last. Finally came the seventh generation, and with them, the cosmic preparation was complete. These were Izanagi no Mikoto and Izanami no Mikoto, he who invites and she who invites. Unlike their predecessors who emerged and hid, these two would act, they would speak, they would create through desire and will and love. Standing at the edge of heaven, these two looked down upon the formless chaos below. The other gods had given them a magnificent gift, a jeweled spear called Ame no Nuhoko. When they stirred the primordial brine with this celestial weapon, it would make the sound of the world's first ocean, the sound that every shore has echoed ever since. Section 2. Izanagi and Izanami, the divine creators. The sound of footsteps on the floating bridge of heaven. Picture now a bridge that spans the space between being and becoming, between the ordered realm of heaven and the chaos waiting below. This is Ame no Ukihashi, the floating bridge of heaven, and upon it stand two figures whose union will birth the very land of Japan. Izanagi, the male who invites, carries himself with the bearing of sky and wind. Izanami, the female who invites, moves with the grace of earth and water. They are the first deities to possess form, as we understand it, the first to look upon each other with recognition, and eventually, with love. The assembled gods of heaven had given them a task that had never before been attempted, to descend to the edge of chaos and create something solid, something lasting. The jeweled spear in Izanagi's hand caught the light of heaven itself, its blade sharp enough to cut between what is and what could be. Together, they walked to the edge of the bridge. Below them swirled the primordial waters, making sounds like the breathing of a sleeping giant. When Izanagi thrust the spear downward and stirred, the cosmos itself seemed to hold its breath. The sound was unlike anything that had existed before, a deep, churning, like thick cream being transformed into butter, like the earth's first mud being mixed in a divine potter's bowl. Round and round they stirred, and when they lifted the spear, the drops that fell from its tip did not simply disappear back into the chaos. They thickened, they hardened. They became the island of Onogoro, whose name means self-forming. This first land was barely more than a sandbar, yet upon it, all solid earth would be founded. The two deities descended to this new land, their feet touching solid ground that existed because of their own actions. Imagine that moment, the first footprints in earth that had never before existed, the first shadows cast by bodies upon ground that had just learned how to be solid. On this island, they built a palace with a great pillar called Ame no Mihashira, the pillar of heaven, which reached from earth back up toward the celestial realm. This pillar made a sound like a great tree growing at impossible speed, its roots grinding through rock, its crown brushing against the floor of heaven itself. Now came the ceremony that would unite them as the first married couple in existence. They stood on opposite sides of the pillar and began to walk around it, Izanagi moving to the left, Izanami to the right. When they met, their eyes found each other, and for the first time in creation, recognition sparked between male and female. Izanami spoke first, her voice like the first spring wind. "How wonderful to meet such a handsome man," Izanagi replied, his voice like distant thunder. "How wonderful to meet such a beautiful woman," but something was amiss. When their union produced a child, it was not the strong land they expected, but Hiruko, the leech child, boneless and unable to stand. Imagine their divine confusion and sorrow as they placed this failed creation in a boat of reeds and set it upon the waters, watching it drift away into the mists. Some say Hiruko survived, transformed into Ebisu, the laughing god of fishermen and good fortune. But in that moment, the first parents knew only failure. They climbed back to heaven to seek counsel. The elder gods performed divination and discovered the error. Izanami had spoken first during the marriage ceremony, disturbing the cosmic order. They must return and perform the ritual again, this time with Izanagi speaking the first words of recognition. So they descended once more, circled the pillar again, and when they met, Izanagi spoke first. "How wonderful to meet such a beautiful woman." Izanami replied, "How wonderful to meet such a handsome man." This time, their union bore perfect fruit. First came Awaji, the island that would be known for its fertile plains. Then Iyo, which would later be called Shikoku, with its four faces looking toward the cardinal directions. The sound of these islands emerging from the sea was like great whales surfacing, water cascading from newly formed mountains, forests sprouting with the rustling of a million leaves birthing into existence at once. They created Oki, the island that sits like a jewel in the sea. Then came Kyushu, with its 9 provinces spreading like an open hand. The island of Iki emerged like a stepping stone between larger lands. Tsushima rose from the waters, with 2 backs like a resting dragon. Finally came the great island of Honshu, the mainland, stretching like the spine of Japan itself. Each island had its own sound of creation. Awaji hummed with the buzz of rich farmland waiting to be tilled. Shikoku resonated with the chanting of future pilgrims who would walk its holy routes. Kyushu rumbled with the volcanic force that would always simmer beneath its surface. Honshu sang with the voices of millions yet to be born, the future capital cities, the poems that would be written about its mountains and shores. But the divine couple was not finished. Having created the solid lands, they began to birth the deities who would govern the forces of nature. From their union came gods of wind and water, deities of harbours and sea straits, spirits of mountains and valleys. Each birth was easier than the last, as if creation itself was learning how to create. They gave birth to the god of trees, whose first cry sounded like wind through a forest canopy. They brought forth the god of mountains, whose birth cry was the sound of avalanches and peaceful snow. The deity of the plains emerged with the whisper of grass seeds scattering on the breeze. For a time, creation was pure joy. Izanagi and Izanami worked in perfect harmony, their creative powers complementing each other like the tide and the shore. The sounds of new existence filled the air. The gurgle of the first rivers finding their paths to the sea, the crack of the first lightning, teaching the sky how to speak, the gentle patter of the first rain, learning how to fall. This was the golden age of creation, when everything was new and possible, when the world grew like a garden tended by loving hands. But as with all periods of perfect happiness, it could not last. The very power that allowed them to create would soon demand a terrible price, and the sound of creation's joy would transform into creation's first lament. Section 3. The Tragedy of Divine Birth. The crackling of cosmic fire growing ever louder. The rhythm of creation had become a dance between Izanagi and Izanami. Each deity they birthed, adding another movement to the cosmos. Listen to the roll call of their divine children, each name carrying the sound of its domain. Oho Watatsumi, the great god of the sea, whose birth sounded like all the world's waves crashing at once. Shina Tsuhiko, the wind god, who emerged with a howl that would forever echo in every storm. As summer follows spring with increasing warmth, so too did the intensity of their creations grow. The goddess of food, Oho-ge Tsuhime, came forth with the sound of grain rustling in infinite fields. The god of fresh water, Haya-aki Suhiko, arrived with the babbling of every brook that would ever run down a mountainside. But creation is not without cost. Each birth drew more from Izanami, the mother of islands and gods. If you could have seen her then, you would have noticed how her radiance, once bright as heaven itself, had begun to flicker like a candle burning low. The effort of bringing forth so much existence was slowly consuming her divine essence. Yet they continued, driven by the momentum of creation itself. They birthed Kuku no Chi, the god of trees, and Kaya no Hime, the goddess of grasses. With each new deity, the world became more complete, more complex, more alive. The air itself seemed to thicken with the presence of so many divine forces. Then came the moment that would shatter the harmony of creation forever. Izanami felt within herself a new stirring, a heat unlike anything she had carried before. This was Kagutsuchi, the god of fire, and his very essence was antithetical to the womb that bore him. As he grew within her, she could feel herself burning from the inside out. The birth of fire into the world should have been a moment of triumph. Fire would bring warmth to the cold, light to the darkness, the power to forge metal and cook food. But as Kagutsuchi emerged, his blazing form consumed his mother's flesh. Her screams echoed through all the realms, a sound so terrible that mountains cracked and rivers reversed their flow. Picture Izanagi's horror as he watched his beloved writhing in agony, her divine body blackening and crumbling like paper in flame. He reached for her, but the heat drove him back. He called her name, but she could no longer hear him over the roaring of the fire that was her own child. Even in her agony, Izanami continued to create. From her vomit came Kanayama Biko and Kanayama Hime, the god and goddess of metals, born from the melting of her divine essence. From her feces emerged Haniyasu Hiko and Haniyasu Hime, the deities of clay and earth. From her urine sprang Mitsu, Ha no Mi, the goddess of fresh water, and Waku Musubi, whose descendant would be the goddess of grains. Each of these births was accompanied by sounds of transformation. Metal ringing as it cooled, clay squelching into form, water hissing as it met fire. These were not joyful births, but agonized expulsions. Creation through destruction, life through death. Finally, mercifully, Izanami's suffering ended. Her last breath sounded like wind leaving a cave, never to return. She lay still, the first being to discover what death meant. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in creation, an absence that screamed across all existence. Izanagi fell to his knees beside her still form. His tears were the first tears, and as they struck the ground, they became more deities. The crying god, Naki Sawame, whose voice would forever echo in the sound of mourning. His rage and grief intermingled like storm clouds gathering into a typhoon. He turned to the infant god of fire, Kagutsuchi, who blazed there innocent of his crime, knowing only that he existed and burned as was his nature. With a cry that split the heavens, Izanagi drew his sword, Totsuka no Tsurugi, its blade singing through the air with the sound of ultimate judgment. The sword fell, and Kagutsuchi was cut into pieces. But even this act of destruction became creation. From the blood on the blade came 8 more deities, gods of thunder and lightning, of volcanic mountains and violent rainstorms. From Kagutsuchi's dismembered body arose 8 mountain gods, each one a volcano, that would forever remember the fire god's death in their eruptions. The blood that splattered on the rocks became Kuro Kami, the dragon god of rain and snow, and Take Mikazuchi, the god of thunder and swords. Every drop that fell created something new, as if the universe itself refused to let anything truly die, only transform. Izanagi stood among this carnage, become creation, his sword dripping with divine blood, his beloved dead before him, surrounded by the newborn gods who existed only because of tragedy. The sound was overwhelming. The wailing of orphaned deities, the crackle of still burning fire, the rumble of newly formed mountains, learning their shape, and underneath it all, the terrible silence where Izanami's voice should have been. He gathered her body in his arms. She felt strange, neither heavy nor light, neither warm nor cold, but simply absent, like holding the memory of someone rather than the person themselves. He carried her to the border between the land of the living and the land of the dead, a place that had not existed until that moment, but suddenly was, because creation, now needed a place for things that ceased to be. There, at the boundary between life and death, Izanagi buried his beloved Izanami. The first funeral was performed in absolute solitude, with only the wind as witness and the rain as tears. He placed great boulders over her resting place, creating the first tomb, the first monument to loss. As he completed the burial rites, he heard something that chilled even his divine heart. A voice, soft and distant, calling from somewhere beyond the grave. It was Izanami, but not as she had been. Death had changed her, transformed her into something else, something that belonged to a different realm entirely. The sound of her voice from beyond death was like an echo in reverse, starting soft and growing louder, closer, more insistent. She was calling him, inviting him, just as her name suggested she would. But this was not an invitation to create. This was an invitation to follow her into the darkness that she had discovered, the realm that existed as creation's shadow. Section 4. The Descent to Yomi. Footsteps echoing in absolute darkness. Grief makes even gods act against their better judgment. Izanagi stood at the entrance to Yomi, the land of the dead, where no living being had ever ventured. The gateway yawned before him like the mouth of a giant beast, exhaling air that smelled of earth that had never known sunlight, of water that had never reflected sky. The descent began gradually, the light of the living world fading with each step. First, colours drained away, leaving only shades of grey. Then even those faded to black deeper than night, for night still knows stars. This was the darkness of closed eyes, of deep caves, of the space between thoughts. The path spiraled downward, and with each turn, the sounds of the living world grew fainter. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Instead, new sounds emerged from the darkness, dripping water that counted eternities between drops, the whisper of things that moved without bodies, the soft breathing of the earth itself, sleeping its eternal sleep. Izanagi called out his beloved's name, and his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, returned to him changed and strange. Izanami, my beloved wife, come back with me. Our work is not finished. The lands we created are incomplete without you. For a long moment, only silence answered. Then, from deeper in the darkness than seemed possible, came a voice he both recognized and didn't. It was Izanami, but her voice had acquired the hollow quality of wind through empty halls. My beloved husband, she called back, and even in death there was longing in her voice. You have come too late. I have eaten the food of this land, the dark fruit that grows without Sunday. I belong to Yomi now, as surely as the living belong to the light. The sound of her voice drew him forward, deeper into the underworld. The path became narrower, the ceiling lower, until even a god had to stoop to continue. The walls felt like they were made not of stone but of concentrated darkness, substantial yet indefinite. Finally, he reached a great palace, made of shadow and silence. Its gates stood open, but beyond them was a darkness so thick it seemed solid. From within came Izanami's voice again. I must speak with the gods of this realm. Wait here, my love, and do not look upon me. Promise me this. Izanagi promised, his word hanging in the dark air like a physical thing. He heard her footsteps retreating into the palace, each step quieter than the last, until he couldn't tell if he was hearing her movement or just remembering the sound. Time moves differently in the land of the dead. Izanagi waited what felt like days, perhaps years. In the living world, mountains might have grown and worn away in the time he stood there, or perhaps only moments passed. The darkness made everything uncertain. Unable to bear the waiting any longer, Izanagi broke his promise. He took one of the combs from his hair and lit it, creating the first light that Yomi had ever seen. The flame was small, barely more than a firefly's glow, but in that absolute darkness, it blazed like a Sunday. What he saw in that terrible light would haunt creation forever. Izanami lay in the palace, but she was no longer the beautiful goddess he had known. Death had claimed her completely. Her once perfect form was now corruption itself. Maggots writhed where her eyes should have been. Her flesh had become the colour and texture of earth that had rotted from within. 8 thunder gods had made their home in her corpse, each one crackling with the power of decay. From her head crouched Oho Ikazuchi, the great thunder. On her chest sat Kuro Ikazuchi, the black thunder. Her stomach housed Saku Ikazuchi, the splitting thunder. Her genitals contained Waka Ikazuchi, the young thunder. Her left hand gripped Tsuchi Ikazuchi, the earth thunder. Her right hand held Naru Ikazuchi, the roaring thunder. Her left foot was home to Fushi Ikazuchi, the prostrate thunder. Her right foot harboured Hono Ikazuchi, the fire thunder. The sound these thunder gods made was not the clean crack of sky lightning, but the wet rumble of decay, the sound of things falling apart from within. They turned their terrible faces toward Izanagi, and their eyes were like negative stars, points of absolute darkness in faces of corruption. Izanami's voice, when she spoke, was the sound of grave dirt falling. "You have shamed me, husband. You have looked upon my disgrace." Her rage was not hot but cold, the fury of things that should not be disturbed. She rose from her resting place, and the sound was like a mountain of bones shifting. The thunder gods detached themselves from her body with wet, tearing sounds, and together with the hags of Yomi, the Shikome, they began to pursue Izanagi. The creator god turned and ran, his divine dignity forgotten in the face of such horror. Behind him came the sound of pursuit, hundreds of feet that weren't quite feet, breathing that wasn't quite breathing, the angry cries of the dishonoured dead. Izanagi threw down his crown, and it transformed into grapes that the demons stopped to devour. The sound of their eating was like rain on a mass grave. He cast down his comb, and it became bamboo shoots that the hags paused to consume with sounds like bones breaking. Still, Izanami pursued, and she was the most terrible of all, for she moved not with the chaotic scramble of demons, but with the inexorable pace of death itself, steady and certain. Finally, Izanagi reached the slope that led back to the world of light. His breath came in gasps that echoed off the narrow walls. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. At the border between death and life stood a great boulder, and with strength born of desperation, he rolled it across the entrance, sealing Yomi from the world above. From behind the stone came Izanami's voice, filled with the cold rage of the abandoned. "My former husband, for this betrayal, I shall strangle 1,000 of your people every day." Izanagi, breathing heavily on the side of life, replied with divine authority, "My former wife, then I shall cause 1,500 to be born each day." And so the balance was set. Death would always take its due, but life would always triumph by creating more than death could claim. The sound of this cosmic bargain echoed through all the realms, a contract that could never be broken. This boulder between the worlds, the Yomotsu Hirasaka, would forever mark the boundary between life and death. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, people claim they can still hear scratching from the other side. Izanami testing the seal, ensuring her realm remained separate from the world of the living. Izanagi stood there for a long moment, his hand pressed against the stone that separated him from his beloved. On one side, the god of creation. On the other, the goddess who had become death itself. The boulder was cold beneath his palm, colder than anything in the living world should be. Finally, he turned away and climbed toward the light. With each step, the sounds of Yomi faded, the scratching, the whispers, the thunder of decay. By the time he emerged into daylight, the entrance had become just another cave, unremarkable and forgotten, though it still exists somewhere in the land, waiting. The first age of creation was over. It had begun with 2 deities in love, stirring the primordial waters with hope and purpose. It ended with those same deities separated forever, one ruling the dead, the other soon to create the gods who would rule the living. The sound of creation would continue, but it would never again be as innocent as it had been in those first moments on the floating bridge of heaven. The sun that greeted Izanagi as he emerged from Yomi seemed different somehow, as if it too had learned that all things, even divine things, must eventually end. But that same sun also promised that endings were just another kind of beginning, and creation's greatest chapters were yet to be written. Section 5. The Purification and Three Noble Children. The sound of running water over sacred stones. Izanagi emerged from the underworld, changed, carrying the pollution of death upon his divine form, like a shroud woven from shadows. The taint of Yomi clung to him, invisible yet undeniable, making the very air around him feel heavy and wrong. Birds fell silent as he passed. Flowers turned their faces away. Even the wind seemed reluctant to touch him. He knew, with the instinct that all divine beings possess, that he could not remain in this state. The contamination of death had no place in the world of the living. He needed purification, needed to wash away not just the physical remnants of his journey, but the spiritual weight of what he had witnessed. Following the sound of flowing water, he came to Ahagihara, a place where a river met the sea in the land of Tsukushi, what mortals would later call Kyushu. Picture this estuary in your mind, the fresh water running clear and cold from mountain springs, meeting the salt water that had known the touch of sun and moon. The sound here was a constant mingling, fresh and salt, life and preservation, a conversation between two kinds of purity. Izanagi stood at the water's edge and began to remove his clothing, each piece heavy with the essence of the underworld. As he cast aside his staff, it became the god Tsukitasu Funado, who would forever guard the crossroads between realms. His belt, falling to the ground, transformed into Nagachiha, the god of long roads. Every item of clothing, every ornament, became a deity. As it left his body, 12 gods in all, each one carrying away a portion of his contamination. Now naked as he had been at creation's dawn, Izanagi stepped into the water. The first touch was shocking, not from cold, but from the collision between the death taint he carried and the absolute purity of the flowing water. Steam rose from his skin, making sounds like whispered prayers ascending to heaven. He waded deeper, feeling the current pull at the pollution clinging to him. First, he dove beneath the surface completely, and from this immersion arose Yasomagatsuhi and Ohomatsuhi, gods of misfortune and calamity, born from the evil he had brought back from Yomi. The water around them turned black as night, before the current carried them away, their birth cries sounding like warnings of disasters yet to come. Rising from the water, Izanagi dove again, and this time emerged Kamunaobi and Ohonaobi, the gods of restoration and recovery, whose purpose would be to heal what the misfortune gods destroyed. Their arrival sounded like the first breath after drowning, like broken bones knitting back together, like hope returning after despair. A third time he submerged himself, staying under until his divine lungs burned for air. From this deepest purification came the gods of the sea's surface, middle, and bottom. Uwatsutsunoo, Nakatsutsunoo, and Sokotsutsunoo, 3 brothers who would divide the ocean's realms between them. Their emergence made the sea sing in 3-part harmony: high waves, middle currents, and deep tides. Finally cleansed of Yomi's taint, Izanagi stood in the shallows where river met sea. The water around him was crystal clear once more, singing its eternal song of motion and renewal. He felt lighter than he had since Izanami's death, though the grief remained, cleaned now of its putrefaction, but not of its weight. He scooped water in his hands and began the most sacred purifications of all. Listen carefully, for what happened next would shape all the ages to come. When he washed his left eye, the water that ran down his face began to glow with a light that had never before existed. This light grew brighter and warmer until it coalesced into a being of such radiance that Izanagi had to shield his gaze. This was Amaterasu, whose name means heaven shining, and her first cry was like the dawn that ends the longest night. She opened her eyes, and suddenly the world knew what golden meant. Her laughter was the sound of light itself learning how to dance. Picture her in that first moment, a goddess whose very essence was illumination, whose hair streamed like solar flares, whose smile could warm the coldest heart or the deepest winter. She stood in the shallow water, and wherever her light touched, life quickened. Flowers that had been buds suddenly bloomed. Fish in the water flashed silver and gold. The very air around her shimmered with possibilities. When Izanagi washed his right eye, another light emerged. But this one was silver, where Amaterasu's was gold, cool where hers was warm. This was Tsukuyomi, the moon god, whose first breath misted in the air like frost, even in the warm estuary. His beauty was equal to his sister's, but opposite in nature, like a perfect reflection in still water, where her presence made sounds louder and clearer. His brought a hush, a quieting, the peace of contemplation. Imagine these two standing together for the first time, the sun and moon as siblings, day and night as family. They looked at each other with instant recognition and immediate understanding that they were connected yet destined to be apart. When they stood close, their lights mingled into something like twilight, neither day nor night but the bridge between them. Finally, Izanagi washed his nose, that organ which bridges the outside air with the inner breath. What emerged from this cleansing was neither light nor peace, but pure force. Susanoo burst forth with a sound like typhoon winds, like tsunamis crashing against cliffs, like the earth itself cracking open in rage. His name meant violent male, and his first act was to roar so loudly that mountains trembled and rivers reversed their course. Where his siblings embodied cosmic order, Susanoo was chaos incarnate. His hair was wild as storm clouds. His eyes flashed like lightning. His very presence made the air pressure drop, as before a terrible storm. Yet he was not evil, merely uncontrolled, like nature at its most raw and powerful. His tears, when they came, fell as torrential rain. His laughter was thunder. His footsteps left floods in their wake. Izanagi looked upon these three children with a mixture of pride and trepidation. They were his alone, born not from union, but from purification, created not through love, but through cleansing. They were perfect, but their perfection contained the seeds of conflict that anyone could see. How could the sun and storm exist in the same sky without friction? How could absolute order and absolute chaos share the same cosmos? To you, Amaterasu, Izanagi said, and his voice carried the weight of divine decree. I give the plane of high heaven. You shall rule the sky and bring light to all creation. Amaterasu bowed, and her acceptance sounded like birds singing at dawn, like the promise of every clear morning that would ever be. To you, Tsukuyomi, the father continued, I give the realm of night. You shall rule the darkness and the mysteries it contains. Tsukuyomi's acceptance was silent as moonrise, present but unspoken, visible but voiceless. And to you, Susanoo, Izanagi said, and here he paused, as if already foreseeing the troubles to come, I give the seas and storms, the wild places where chaos serves its purpose. But Susanoo did not bow. Instead, he wept, and his weeping was like monsoon rains that would not cease. The sound grew from sobbing to wailing, to a keening that made even the gods cover their ears. When Izanagi asked why he cried, Susanoo's answer would set in motion events that would shake heaven itself. I do not want the seas, he wailed. I want to visit my mother in the land of the dead. Section 6. Amaterasu. The sun's radiance. The gentle hum of divine looms, weaving clouds, high above the world, where the air is so pure it has never known dust, where the light has no source because it simply is, lies Takamagahara, the plane of high heaven. Picture a realm where every surface gleams with soft radiance, where buildings are made from crystallized starlight, where the very ground beneath divine feet chimes like bells with each step. This became Amaterasu's domain, and under her rule, it transformed from a simple celestial plane into an organized paradise. She established courts and ceremonies, creating the rituals that would govern not just heaven, but eventually earth as well. Listen to the sound of heaven under her reign. The rustle of silk robes as deities move through halls of pearl, the tinkle of jade ornaments, the soft murmur of divine administrators discussing the proper rotation of seasons. At the center of her heavenly domain, Amaterasu built the weaving hall, a pavilion where she and her attendants would weave the cloth of clouds, the fabric of sunrise and sunset. The looms they used made music as they worked, each thread singing its own note, harmonizing into melodies that humans would sometimes hear in their dreams and wake, trying to remember. Picture Amaterasu at her loom, her fingers moving with impossible grace, pulling threads of light itself through the warp and weft. The cloth she wove was not merely beautiful but functional, becoming the robes worn by gods, the veils that separated sacred spaces from profane, the very fabric of reality in its most refined form. When she worked, she hummed, and her humming became the resonance that holds the universe together at its fundamental level. But her greatest creation was the establishment of rice cultivation in the heavenly fields. She planted the first rice paddies in Takamagahara, fields that reflected the sky so perfectly that sometimes even the gods couldn't tell which was real and which was reflection. The sound of these celestial rice fields was like whispered promises, each grain containing the potential to feed millions yet unborn. She taught the lesser deities how to flood the fields at just the right moment, how to read the signs of growth in the color of the leaves, how to harvest with gratitude rather than greed. The rituals she established around rice cultivation would become the foundation of civilization itself. The sound of water entering the paddies, that particular gurgle and flow, originated here in heaven under her instruction. Every morning, Amaterasu would rise and dress in robes that she herself had woven from dawn light. Her morning ritual was precise and beautiful. First, she would wash her face in the dew collected from heaven's highest peaks, each drop containing the essence of 1,000 mornings. The sound of this divine ablution was like rain on leaves, but clearer, purer. Then she would walk to the edge of heaven, to the place where the celestial realm meets the void, and she would begin her daily journey across the sky. But this was not yet the sun, as humans would know it. This was the raw, undiluted light of divinity itself, too pure for mortal eyes to perceive directly. In her palace, which was built from clouds that had been convinced to hold solid form, she held court. The other gods would come with their concerns and disputes, and she would listen with patience that could outlast mountains. Her judgments were always fair, though sometimes their fairness was so perfect it seemed harsh to those who had hoped for mercy over justice. One day, the god of winds came to her, complaining that the god of rain had stolen his clouds. She listened to both sides, then decreed that clouds belonged to neither, but to themselves, and both wind and rain could borrow them as needed, but never own them. The sound of divine agreement to this judgment was like the settling of dust after a storm. Another time, the goddess of cherries complained that the goddess of plums had made her fruit bloom first, stealing the honor of announcing spring. Amaterasu's solution was to give each their own perfect moment. Plums would bloom first, but in solitude, cherries later, but in magnificent abundance. Both goddesses left satisfied, their footsteps chiming like the very flowers they governed. The weaving hall was not just Amaterasu's workshop, but her sanctuary. Here, she would retreat when the burden of bringing light to all creation grew heavy. The rhythm of the loom soothed her. The transformation of raw light into woven reality gave her purpose beyond mere illumination. Her attendants, all goddesses of various aspects of daylight, would work alongside her in companionable silence broken only by the music of their craft. Among these attendants was Wakahirume, Amaterasu's younger sister, or perhaps her younger self. Accounts differ in the telling. She was especially skilled at weaving the clouds that would carry rain, each one precisely crafted to hold exactly the right amount of water for the lands below. The sound of her particular loom was like distant thunder, always promising but never threatening. The rice fields of heaven required constant attention, and Amaterasu took this duty seriously. She would walk among the paddies, her light causing the water to sparkle like scattered diamonds, the growing rice to rustle with anticipation of harvest. She instituted the Nianame-sai, the festival of the first rice, where the gods would gather to taste the new grain and give thanks for abundance. Picture this festival in your mind's ear. Hundreds of deities assembled in the great courtyard of heaven, the sound of their conversations like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The ceremonial pounding of rice into mochi, that rhythmic thud that echoes even today in autumn festivals. The first bite of new rice, so perfect that even gods would close their eyes in appreciation. It was during one of these peaceful periods, when heaven operated in perfect harmony under Amaterasu's gentle rule, that disturbing news began to arrive from below. Her brother Susanoo, instead of ruling the seas as their father had decreed, was creating chaos wherever he went. His storms were not the necessary rains that nourished the earth, but violent tantrums that destroyed without purpose. The messenger gods would arrive at her palace, their feathers or scales still dripping with storm rain, to report his latest transgression. He had flooded a village that had just finished planting. He had sent waves to destroy a careful arrangement of coastal rocks that had taken millennia to perfect. He had turned clear lakes into mud through his thrashing. Each time, Amaterasu would sigh, a sound like wind through wheat fields, and make excuses for her brother. He is young, she would say. He misses our mother, whom he never knew. He will learn restraint in time. But privately, she began to prepare. She knew Susanoo's nature, had known it from the moment he emerged roaring from their father's nose. She reinforced the boundaries of heaven, weaving extra layers of protective cloth around the sacred spaces. She instructed her attendants in defensive protocols, teaching them to recognize the signs of approaching storms. Yet even as she prepared for trouble, she continued her daily duties without fail. Every morning, she brought light. Every evening, she returned to heaven to weave. The rice grew. The festivals continued. The sound of heaven remained harmonious, though now with an undertone of tension, like a perfectly tuned instrument with one string wound just a bit too tight. She began to create special items, working alone in the weaving hall at hours when even gods slept. A mirror that could show truth through any deception, jewels that would always return to their rightful owner, a sword that could cut through bonds both physical and spiritual. She told no one about these creations, hiding them in the deepest recesses of her palace. For Amaterasu, in her wisdom, understood something that would soon become terribly relevant. When perfect order meets perfect chaos, something has to break. And when gods break, creation itself trembles. Section 7. The violent storm god, thunder rolling closer with each passing moment. While Amaterasu cultivated harmony in heaven, Susanoo raged through the lower realms like a force of nature, refusing to be contained. His tears had not stopped since his father gave him dominion over the seas. They fell as typhoons that scattered fishing boats like leaves. They fell as floods that turned rivers into dragons that devoured their own banks. They fell as the kind of rain that sounds like the sky is being torn apart. Picture Susanoo in those days, a god whose very presence was meteorological catastrophe. His hair whipped constantly in winds of his own creation, dark strands like storm clouds given form. His robes, instead of flowing gracefully like other deities, snapped and cracked like sails in a hurricane. When he walked, The ground beneath him grew soggy with his tears. When he spoke, windows rattled 1,000 miles away. The seas he was meant to rule cowered from him. Fish dove deep to avoid the constant churning of his emotional storms. Whales changed their migration routes to avoid waters he frequented. Even the dragon kings who ruled the underwater palaces sent formal complaints to heaven about their impossible overlord. Why? Izanagi asked his son, finding him on a mountaintop that had once been peaceful but was now perpetually shrouded in storm clouds. Why do you weep and rage instead of fulfilling your duties? Susanoo's answer was always the same, delivered through tears that fell like rain made of pure emotion. I want to see my mother. I want to go to Nei no Katasukuni, the land of roots where she dwells. His obsession with Izanami, the mother he had never known, who had died giving birth to fire before he was even conceived, consumed him entirely. He imagined her constantly, building elaborate fantasies of what she might have been like. In his mind, she would have understood his storms, would have loved his chaos, would have defended him against a father and siblings who wanted him to be something he could never be, controlled. The sound of his constant lamenting became the background noise of existence. Farmers learned to read his moods in the types of rain. Straight down meant he was melancholy, sideways meant rage, swirling meant confusion. They planted and harvested according to his emotional calendar, adapting their entire agricultural system to a god's unresolved grief. But adaptation has limits, and Susanoo's behavior grew worse rather than better. He began actively destroying rather than simply neglecting. Rice fields ready for harvest would be suddenly flooded with seawater. Carefully maintained irrigation channels would be filled with boulders that appeared overnight. The sound of farmers' despair rose like incense to heaven, where Amaterasu heard and grew concerned. One day, Susanoo went too far. In a fit of rage over some imagined slight, he broke down the divisions between rice paddies that mortals had spent generations perfecting. The sound was horrible. Centuries of careful construction destroyed in moments, wooden barriers splintering, earthen walls dissolving, the careful separation of fields that allowed different families to survive suddenly erased. Worse, he filled in the irrigation ditches with excrement, both divine and otherwise, contaminating the water supply for entire regions. The stench rose to heaven itself, causing even the gods to cover their noses. The sound of pure water being polluted is particular and terrible, like music being played backwards, like harmony becoming discord. It was then that he made a decision that would shake all the realms. I will go to heaven, he announced to the waves that served as his audience. I will say farewell to my sister before I descend to the underworld to find my mother. His journey to heaven was not peaceful. Storm clouds preceded him. Lightning announced his approach. Thunder served as his herald. The very ladder between earth and heaven, the Amano Hashidate, groaned under his tempestuous presence. Each step he took up the celestial bridge left it slightly warped, never quite the same again. In heaven, alarm spread like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Lesser deities fled to the furthest corners of Takamagahara. The gods of gentle rains and morning mists hid themselves. Even the war deities looked nervous, for there is a difference between battle and uncontrolled destruction, and Susanoo represented the latter. Amaterasu, however, did not flee. She had been preparing for this moment, though she had hoped it would never come. She dressed in her most formal robes, but underneath she wore armour made from woven light itself. She tied up her hair in the manner of a warrior, the sound of divine ornaments clinking like tiny bells of warning. She strapped on the sword she had made in secret, its blade humming with power. Most importantly, she took the jewels, the Yasakani no Magatama, and wound them through her hair and around her arms. These beads made a sound like the universe breathing, each one containing enough power to create or destroy entire worlds. She slung 1,000-arrow quiver on her back and took up a bow strung with sunbeams. When she met Susanoo at heaven's border, she was not the gentle weaver of clouds but the sun, in its aspect of burning, destroying, purifying fire. Her stance was that of a warrior ready for battle. The ground beneath her feet began to glow from her concentrated presence. "Why have you come, brother?" she asked, and her voice carried the authority of the highest heaven. "Your domain is below, yet you ascend with storms and violence. What are your intentions?" Susanoo, for perhaps the first time in his existence, seemed taken aback. His sister, whom he had always thought of as gentle and predictable, stood before him as something altogether more formidable. The rain around him lessened to a drizzle, his thunder reduced to uncertain rumbles. "Sister," he said, and his voice contained something it rarely held: respect. "I come only to say farewell. Father has granted my wish to visit our mother in the land of the dead. I wanted to see you once more, before I descend to a place from which there is no return." Amaterasu did not lower her bow. She had learned from their father's story that the underworld changed those who entered it, that even gods could not journey there without consequence. She also knew her brother's nature, how his emotions could swing from gentleness to violence in the space of a heartbeat. "How do I know your intentions are pure?" she challenged. "How can I trust that you won't destroy heaven as you've damaged the lands below?" Susanoo's response would set in motion a contest that would lead to heaven's darkest day, though in that moment his proposal seemed reasonable enough. "Let us swear an oath," he suggested, "and produce children. If the children I create are female, know that my intentions are pure. If they are male, know that I came with evil in my heart." It was a strange proposition, but the creation of oath children was an ancient way of sealing pacts between deities, Amaterasu considered, the sound of her thoughts like solar flares crackling in the silence. "Finally," she agreed, though she kept her weapons close at hand. Section 8. The Cave of Heaven's Light. The sound of heaven holding its breath. The oath-taking between Amaterasu and Susanoo began at the tranquil river of heaven, the Ame no Yasukawa, whose waters run so clear that they reflect not just images, but intentions, not just faces, but souls. The sound of this river is like whispered truths, constant and sometimes uncomfortable. They stood on opposite banks, the sun goddess still in her warrior aspect, the storm god trying to contain his chaotic nature long enough to complete the ritual. Between them, the sacred river sang its ancient song of judgment and witness. "Give me your sword," Amaterasu commanded, and Susanoo drew his blade, Totsuka no Tsurugi, the sword 10 hands long. He passed it across the water, and as Amaterasu took it, the blade hummed with transferred power. She broke it into 3 pieces, each break sounding like thunder contained in crystal. She chewed the pieces, the metal crunching like winter ice in her divine teeth, then breathed out a mist that coalesced into 3 goddesses. These were the Munakata goddesses, Takirabime, Ichikishimahime, and Tagitsuhime. They emerged fully formed, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, their first breaths sounding like ocean waves caressing sand. They would become the protectors of sailors, the goddesses of safe voyages, particularly honoured in the treacherous waters between Japan and the continent. "Now," said Susanoo, "give me your jewels." Amaterasu unwound the long strands of Magatama beads from her hair and arms, 500 jewels in all, each one containing the light of a different hour of day. As she handed them across, they chimed like the music of the spheres, each bead singing its own note, in a harmony that made even the gods pause to listen. Susanoo took the jewels, and rather than chewing them, as his sister had done with the sword, he rattled them like divine dice. The sound built from a gentle shaking to a roar like an avalanche of light. He breathed on them, and his breath, usually destructive, became creative. From this mist emerged 5 male deities. First came Amanushi Homimi, whose name means great sky rice ears, and whose first cry sounded like wind through grain fields. Then Amenehohi, sky sunfire, whose birth was accompanied by the crackling of celestial flames. Amatsuhikone, sky prince, arrived with the sound of divine authority claiming its place. Ikutsuhikone, living prince, brought the sound of vitality itself. Finally came Kumano no Kusubi, whose emergence sounded like the deep forests breathing. "See!" Susanoo exclaimed, his voice triumphant. "I have produced males. But wait, they came from your jewels, so they are your children. The females came from my sword, so they are mine. My intentions are proven pure." The logic was twisted, reversed, essentially a divine trick, but technically within the rules of their oath. Amaterasu, bound by the formal ritual, could not dispute it. The sound of her frustrated acceptance was like the sun gritting its teeth, a grinding of light against light. Believing himself vindicated, Susanoo should have left then. He had said his farewell, proven his intentions technically pure, and was free to journey to the underworld. But victory, even technical victory, went to his head like strong psyche. His nature, temporarily controlled, burst free with doubled force. "I have won!" he roared, and his roar brought unseasonable storms across heaven. "I am proven righteous." In his celebration, he began to rampage through Takamagahara. First, he broke down the divisions between the heavenly rice fields, just as he had done on earth. The sound was worse here, for these were perfect fields, their destruction like the ripping of reality's fabric itself. The divine rice, ready for harvest, was trampled into celestial mud. Then he destroyed the irrigation channels that Amaterasu had carefully constructed, filling them with filth. The pure water of heaven became contaminated, its song changing from clarity to corruption. The other gods watched in horror, but were too fearful to intervene. Who could stand against the storm incarnate? But his worst transgression was yet to come. In his wild celebration, he climbed onto the roof of the weaving hall, where Amaterasu and her attendants worked at their sacred looms. The sound of their weaving, that cosmic harmony that held reality together, was suddenly interrupted by crashing and tearing as Susanoo ripped a hole in the roof. Through this hole, he threw something so shocking, so transgressive, that even speaking of it makes the universe shudder. He had taken a heavenly horse, a piebald colt that carried clouds across the sky, and had flayed it alive, its death screams echoing through all the realms. This bloodied, still twitching corpse he hurled through the roof and onto the looms below. The sound of its impact was wet and wrong, the desecration of sacred space absolute. Blood splattered across the pure cloth of reality. The looms themselves cracked and splintered. But worst of all, Wakahirume, Amaterasu's beloved attendant, startled by the horror, jerked back from her loom. The shuttle she was holding drove through her body, and she fell, the first deity to die in heaven itself. Her death rattle was the sound of innocence, leaving the universe forever. She dissolved into morning mist, never to return, and her loom fell silent, its particular note in the cosmic harmony gone forever, leaving a gap in reality's music that would never be properly filled. Amaterasu stood in the ruins of her weaving hall, covered in the blood of the horse and the dissipating essence of her attendant, and something broke inside the sun goddess. Not rage, for rage would have meant destroying her brother, and some part of her still loved him despite everything. Not despair, for despair would have meant accepting this as the nature of existence. Instead, she felt something no deity had felt before, the desire to simply not exist in this reality anymore. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the weaving hall. The other gods called after her, but she didn't respond. Her light began to dim, not going out but pulling inward, concentrating into her form rather than radiating outward. The sound of light retreating is hard to describe, like inverse dawn, like hope running backwards, like warmth forgetting how to warm. She walked to Ama no Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, a cavern so deep that its back wall had never known light. As she approached, the cave mouth seemed to open wider, welcoming the sun into darkness. She entered without hesitation, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she rolled a massive boulder across the entrance from within, sealing herself in absolute darkness. The moment the cave sealed, existence gasped. The sun was gone. Not set, not dimmed, but gone. Darkness fell across all realms simultaneously. This was not the gentle darkness of night, which has stars and moon and the promise of dawn. This was the darkness of negation, of absence, of void. The sound of universal panic rose like a tide. Birds crashing into trees they couldn't see, humans crying out in terror, even the gods stumbling and calling for light that wouldn't come. In heaven, 800 myriads of gods assembled in the dry bed of the tranquil river, their voices a cacophony of fear and confusion. Without Amaterasu's light, evil spirits emerged from every shadow, which was everywhere. Their chittering and howling made the darkness even more terrible. Plants began to wither. The rice in both heaven and earth stopped growing. The very fabric of reality, without its weaver, began to fray at the edges. Omoikane, the god of wisdom and thought, took charge of the crisis. His voice, usually soft and contemplative, rose above the chaos. We must bring her out, or all creation will return to the void that preceded it. The gods fell silent, realizing the truth of his words. Without the sun, nothing could exist for long. They could already feel themselves beginning to fade, their divine essence dimming like candles running out of wick. "But how?" asked the water goddess. "She has sealed herself away by her own will. We cannot force her. We must entice her," Omoikane declared. "We must make her curious enough to open the cave herself." And so began the most elaborate deception in heaven's history. The gods gathered everything they would need, working in darkness so complete that they had to call out constantly to avoid colliding with each other. They brought roosters from the eternal dawn, birds whose crow could sometimes trick the sun into rising. They gathered the hardest metals from the deepest mountains, the clearest jewels from the highest peaks. Ishikorodome, the goddess of mirrors, was commissioned to create something that had never existed before, a mirror so perfect it could capture and reflect even divine light. The sound of her forge in that darkness was like hope being hammered into shape. Each strike of her hammer, a promise that light might return. Tamanoya, the jewel maker, strung together a necklace of 500 Magatama beads, each one carved in absolute darkness, by touch alone. The jewels chimed against each other like frozen starlight, waiting to shine again. They uprooted a sacred sakaki tree and decorated it with these treasures, along with white and blue cloth streamers. In the darkness, the tree's rustling sounded like whispered prayers, desperate and sincere. But the masterstroke of the plan came from an unexpected source. Amenuzume, usually a minor goddess of dawn and mirth, stepped forward with a proposal that shocked even the desperate assembly. "I will dance," she said simply. "I will dance as no one has danced before." She overturned a wooden tub near the cave entrance, the hollow thump echoing in the darkness. She climbed on top and began to stamp her feet in rhythm. The sound started slow, deliberate, each stamp a heartbeat in the dead universe. Then she began to disrobe. In the darkness, the sound of falling cloth was like whispers of scandal. She danced harder, faster, her feet creating thunder on the overturned tub. She threw aside her upper garments, then her lower ones, dancing in divine nakedness, dancing with an abandon that gods were not supposed to possess. And she laughed. Her laughter started as chuckles, then grew to full-throated guffaws, then to hysterical, uncontrolled mirth. The sound was so unexpected, so inappropriate to the dire situation, that the 800 myriads of gods couldn't help themselves. They began to laugh too. First one, then a dozen, then all of them, their combined laughter shaking heaven itself. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard the commotion. The sound penetrated even her deep despair, for it was the last thing she expected. Joy. How could there be joy when she, the sun, had withdrawn from the world? How could there be laughter in the darkness? Her curiosity, that fatal flaw of all conscious beings, stirred. She called out, her voice muffled by stone. How can you laugh? The sun has gone, yet you celebrate. Aminuzume, still dancing, still naked, called back, we celebrate because we have found a goddess more beautiful than the sun. She shines with a light that needs no source. We no longer need you, Amaterasu. It was the perfect provocation. Amaterasu, despite her despair, felt indignation. More beautiful than the sun? Impossible. She pushed the boulder aside, just slightly, just enough to peek out. The crack she created let out a sliver of light, the first light the universe had seen since she entered the cave. Where is this goddess? She demanded. The gods held up the mirror directly in front of the crack. Amaterasu saw her own reflection, concentrated from her time in the cave, more brilliant than ever. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. She pushed the boulder a bit more to see better, and as she did, Taji Karao, the god of strength, who had been hiding beside the cave, grabbed the boulder and hurled it away with a sound like mountains being born. Before Amaterasu could retreat, the gods stretched a sacred rope, a shimenawa, across the cave entrance. You cannot go back, they said. The universe needs its Sunday. Amaterasu stood there, blinking in her own light, seeing the devastation that her absence had caused. The withered plants, the cowering humans far below, the evil spirits fleeing from her restored radiance. She saw Aminuzume, still naked, still dancing, though now with joy rather than desperation. And despite everything, Amaterasu smiled. It was a small smile, sad at the edges, but it was enough. The sun had returned. As for Susanoo, his punishment was swift and complete. The gods shaved his beard, pulled out his fingernails and toenails, and banished him from heaven forever. The sound of his descent from Takamagahara was like a storm breaking apart, thunder becoming whimpers, lightning becoming tears. But that is a story for the next turning of our tale, when the storm god would find redemption in the most unexpected place, facing a monster whose evil made his own chaos seem like gentle rain in comparison. Section 9. Susanoo's Redemption Arc. Footsteps of a banished god, stumbling through unfamiliar earth. Susanoo's fall from heaven was not graceful. Picture a star being torn from the sky, leaving a trail of fading light and regret. He tumbled through clouds that no longer acknowledged him as divine, through air that rejected his very presence, until he crashed into the earth of Izumo province, with a sound like thunder, learning how to weep. He lay there in the crater of his own making, no longer the mighty storm god, but something altogether more pitiful, a divine being stripped of purpose, cast out from the only home he had known. His beard, once wild and magnificent as storm clouds, had been shaved, leaving his face naked and vulnerable. Where his fingernails and toenails had been pulled out, there was only throbbing pain, a reminder with every movement of his transgression. The rain that fell around him now was just rain, not the orchestrated tempests of his divine tantrums, but simple precipitation that didn't recognize him as its master. He could hear it hitting leaves and stones with democratic equality, no longer jumping to his emotional commands. For the first time in his existence, Susanoo was alone with consequences he couldn't storm away from. He wandered through Izumo like a ghost of his former self. The locals, when they saw him, didn't see a god but just another vagrant, his clothes torn and muddy, his eyes hollow with loss. Dogs barked at him. Children threw stones. The sound of their rejection was worse than any divine punishment, for it was the sound of irrelevance. Following the Hii River upstream, seeking its source in hopes of finding some semblance of the purity he had lost, Susanoo heard something that made him stop. It was crying, but not the self-pitying tears he had shed for so long. This was the sound of true grief, the kind that comes from losing something precious rather than wanting something impossible. Through the trees, he saw them, an elderly couple and a young woman of extraordinary beauty, all three weeping as though their hearts would break. The sound of their sorrow harmonized into something that even Susanoo, wrapped in his own misery, couldn't ignore. "Why do you weep?" he asked, stepping from the shadows. The elderly man, Ashinazuchi, looked up with eyes red from crying. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Stranger, we weep for our daughters. Once we had 8, each one beautiful as mountain flowers. But every year, the Yamato no Orochi comes. At the mention of this name, the very air seemed to grow colder. Yamato no Orochi, the 8-forked serpent, whose very existence was an affront to natural order. Susanoo had heard whispers of this creature, even in heaven, a monster so terrible that even gods spoke of it in hushed tones. "Tell me of this beast," Susanoo said, and for the first time since his banishment, his voice carried interest beyond his own suffering. The old woman, Tenazuchi, took up the tale, her voice like autumn leaves, rustling with fear. "It is a serpent, but calling it that is like calling the ocean a puddle. Its body stretches across 8 valleys and 8 peaks. It has 8 heads and 8 tails. Its eyes are like winter cherries, red as blood and always watching. Moss and cryptomeria trees grow upon its back, so vast is its form. When it moves, the earth shakes. When it breathes, forests wither." "And your daughters?" Susanoo prompted, though he could guess the answer. "Each year it comes," Ashinazuchi continued, "and each year it demands one of our daughters. We have given 7 already. Watch them walk into the monster's waiting mouths. Tomorrow, it comes for our last daughter, Kushinada Hime, and we will have nothing left but memories and empty arms." Susanoo looked at Kushinada Hime, really looked at her for the first time. She was indeed beautiful, but it was a beauty touched by doom, like the last flower of autumn knowing winter approaches. She stood straight despite her fear, and in her posture, he saw something that stirred memories of his sister's courage. "What if I could save her?" The words left his mouth before he consciously decided to speak them. The family looked at him, this ragged stranger with wild eyes and dirty clothes, and hope warred with disbelief in their faces. "How could you, a wanderer, face the Orochi?" asked Ashinazuchi. "Armies have tried, heroes have attempted, all have become meals for its 8 mouths." Susanoo almost told them then, almost declared his divine nature, but something held him back. Perhaps it was humility, finally learned. Perhaps it was understanding that being a god hadn't prevented him from becoming what he now was. Instead, he simply said, "I have some experience with monsters, but if I save your daughter, I ask one thing in return." "Anything!" the parents exclaimed together, their voices harmonizing in desperate hope. "Give me Kushinada Hime as my wife." The request hung in the air like a held breath. The parents looked at their daughter, who studied this strange, intense man who spoke of fighting impossible monsters as though it were merely difficult rather than suicidal. "Who are you?" Kushinada Hime asked, her voice like water over stones, clear and questioning. "I am." Susanoo paused, then spoke truth without decoration. "I am someone who has done terrible things and seeks to do one good thing. I am the brother of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, though I doubt she would claim me now. I am Susanoo, banished from heaven for crimes against harmony itself." The sound of divine names being spoken made the forest itself pause. Birds stopped singing, wind stopped blowing. Even the distant roar of the Hii River seemed to quiet. The family fell to their knees, recognizing they were in the presence of a god, even a banished one. "Rise," Susanoo said tiredly. "I am no one to kneel to, but god or not, I will face the Orochi. Will you trust me with your daughter?" The parents looked at each other, entire conversations passing in glances that only decades of marriage allow. Finally, Ashinazuchi spoke. "Better she be wife to a banished god who would fight for her, than meal to a monster who would devour her." Kushinada Hime herself made the final decision, stepping forward with grace that made Susanoo's heart remember what it was like to feel something other than rage or self-pity. "I accept," she said simply. Susanoo's preparation for battle was unlike anything the mortals had seen. First, he transformed Kushinada Hime, but not cruelly. With a gentleness that surprised even himself, he changed her into a comb, an ornate piece that held all her beauty in concentrated form. He placed her in his hair and whispered, "Trust me, you will be yourself again when this is over." Then he gave instructions that seemed like madness. "Brew sake, the strongest you can make, not 1 barrel but 8. Build a fence with 8 gates, and at each gate, place a platform. On each platform, a barrel of sake." The parents, though confused, obeyed. The sound of construction filled the valley, hammering that echoed off mountains, the glug of sake being poured into massive barrels, the creak of gates being fitted into frames. All the while, the air grew heavier, filled with the approaching presence of something vast and wrong. As the sun set, painting the sky the colour of blood, a new sound emerged from the distance. It was like 8 thunderstorms arguing, 8 earthquakes competing, 8 avalanches racing. The Yamato no Orochi was coming. Trees fell before it like grass before a scythe. The ground trembled with each movement of its impossible body, and the smell, even Susanoo, who had weathered the stench of the underworld on his father's clothes, had to fight, not to gag. It was the smell of centuries of death, of things that should not be, of nature perverted into abomination. The monster arrived at the fence as the last light fled the sky, and even in darkness, its eyes glowed like 8 pairs of malevolent stars. Each head was different, yet equally terrible. One had teeth like swords, another had a tongue that dripped acid, a third breathed clouds of poison. They moved independently, yet with horrific coordination, like a nightmare choreographed by madness itself. The heads approached the gates, suspicious at first, but the smell of sake, sweet and strong, drew them like flowers draw bees. One head sampled the first barrel, its tongue, thick as a tree trunk, lapping at the liquid. The taste pleased it, and it drank deeper. The other heads, not to be outdone, found their own barrels. The sound of the Orochi drinking was like 8 waterfalls running backwards, liquid disappearing into gullets that could swallow houses whole. The sake was strong, stronger than anything mortal brewers had made before, infused with the desperate hope of parents trying to save their last child. Gradually, the heads began to sway, not with their usual predatory grace, but with the loose motion of intoxication. Their eyes, sharp as murder, began to grow dim. One head tried to roar and produced only a slobbering hiccup. Another attempted to breathe fire and managed only foul-smelling smoke. Finally, with sounds like 8 landslides happening in sequence, the heads crashed to the ground, followed by the enormous body. The Yamato no Orochi, terror of Izumo, destroyer of armies, devourer of daughters, was unconscious, drunk on sake and vulnerability. Susanoo didn't hesitate. He drew his sword, the same blade that had once threatened heaven itself, and went to work. The first head came off with a sound like a mountain being split. The second fell with the noise of a dam bursting. Each decapitation was accompanied by fountains of black blood that hissed when it hit the ground, killing grass, poisoning soil. But it was when he reached the fourth tail that something extraordinary happened. His blade, which had cut through divine flesh and monster sinew alike, struck something and chipped. The sound was wrong, metal, meeting something that shouldn't exist. Curious, Susanoo cut more carefully, peeling back scales the size of shields, parting flesh that reeked of centuries. Inside the tail, he found a sword unlike any he had ever seen. It was perfect, so perfect that looking at it directly was difficult, like trying to stare at the concept of sharpness itself. This was Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, though its true name, Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds, would not be spoken for generations yet. The blade hummed with power that transcended the divine and mortal realms. When Susanoo held it, he could hear the sound of every sword that would ever be forged, the ring of every battle that would ever be fought, the whisper of every blade of grass that would ever be cut. In that moment, holding that impossible sword, covered in monster blood, standing in a field of divine carnage, Susanoo understood something. This blade was not for him. It was too pure, too important, too perfect for someone who had brought such chaos to creation. But he knew who it was for. After the battle, after he had restored Kushinada Hime to her true form, after he had married her with her parents' joyful blessing, after he had built a palace in Izumo that would stand for generations, Susanoo did something no one expected. He took the Kusanagi sword and climbed the long path back toward heaven, not to enter, for he was still banished, but to the border, to the place where earth reached towards sky. There, he left the sword with a message for Amaterasu. "Sister, I offer this not as apology, for my crimes are beyond apology, but as proof that even chaos can occasionally serve order. May this blade serve creation better than I did." The sound of reconciliation is quiet, almost inaudible, like two estranged hearts beginning to beat in rhythm again. Amaterasu accepted the sword, and though she never spoke to Susanoo directly again, the sun seemed to shine a little warmer on Izumo from that day forward. Section 10. The White Rabbit of Inaba. Waves lapping against a beach, where divine comedy would unfold. While Susanoo found redemption in monster slaying, a new story was beginning on the beaches of Inaba, where the sound of waves against sand would witness one of heaven's strangest trials. This tale centers on Okuninushi, whose name means great master of the land, though when our story begins, he was master of nothing, not even his own destiny. Picture, if you will, a rabbit on the island of Oki, white as fresh snow, clever as rabbits are, but perhaps too clever for its own good. This rabbit gazed across the water toward the mainland of Inaba, where better grazing and warmer winters beckoned. The distance was not impossible, but for a rabbit, it might as well have been an ocean. The sound of its frustration was like tiny feet stamping on sand. Insignificant, yet insistent. Now, between Oki and Inaba, the sea was home to wani, creatures that translations struggle with, sometimes called sharks, sometimes crocodiles, but in truth something between and beyond both. These wani were numerous as waves, their backs breaking the surface in endless procession, and the rabbit watched them with calculating eyes. An idea formed in that clever rabbit mind, an idea that made its whiskers twitch with satisfaction. It called out to the wani in a voice sweet as spring clover. "O mighty wani, magnificent creatures of the deep, I have been having an argument with my fellow rabbits, and only you can settle it." The largest wani, curious, rose higher from the water. Its voice was like grinding coral. "What argument could rabbits have that requires our wisdom? We debate who is more numerous," the rabbit proclaimed, "the rabbit clan or the mighty wani clan. If you would help me count, I could prove my point. Line up from here to Inaba, and I will hop across your backs, counting as I go." The wani, their pride appealed to, arranged themselves in a living bridge, backs glistening in the sun, like a road of scales and teeth. The rabbit began to hop, counting loudly. "One magnificent wani, 2 magnificent wani, 3 magnificent wani. The sound of rabbit feet on wani backs was like drums, played by someone who had only heard about rhythms second-hand. Plop, plop, plop across the living bridge, getting closer to Inaba with each hop. The rabbit's heart sang with its own cleverness. But cleverness and wisdom are not the same thing, and as the rabbit reached the last wani, just one jump from the beach of Inaba, it couldn't resist gloating. "Foolish wani," it laughed, its voice shrill with triumph. "I care nothing for counting. I only wanted to use you as a bridge. You've been tricked by a rabbit." The last wani, humiliated and furious, twisted with speed that water dwellers possess and land dwellers forget. Its teeth, numerous as nightmares, caught the rabbit just as it leaped, not to kill, but to strip, tearing away every tuft of white fur, leaving the rabbit naked, pink, and screaming as it tumbled onto the beach of Inaba. The rabbit lay there on the sand, its skin burning from salt water and shame, making sounds no creature should make, whimpering with pain that was both physical and spiritual. Every grain of sand was agony, every breath of wind was torment. The sun, which had seemed so pleasant, now scorched its exposed skin. It was in this state that the rabbit encountered the first group of travellers. 80 gods, all brothers, all princes, all heading to Inaba to court Princess Yakami, whose beauty was renowned throughout the 8 islands. These were the older brothers of Okuninushi, though they treated him less like a brother and more like a servant, making him carry all their baggage like a common porter. The brothers, seeing the rabbit's condition, laughed. The sound of divine mockery is particularly cruel, like bells tuned to discord. "What happened to you, naked thing?" they called out, their voices rich with amusement at another's suffering. The rabbit, between gasps of pain, told its tale. The brothers laughed harder, their mirth echoing off the cliffs. Then, with the casual cruelty that comes from power without wisdom, they gave advice. "If you want to heal," the eldest brother said, his voice dripping false concern, "bathe in the seawater. Then," added another, "climb to the top of that mountain and let the wind dry you. Your fur will grow back thicker than ever." A third lied, knowing full well what would happen. The rabbit, desperate for any relief, followed their advice. The salt water on its raw skin was agony multiplied. The wind, drying the salt into crusts, was torment beyond description. The rabbit's screams echoed across Inaba, a sound that would haunt that beach for generations. As the rabbit lay dying from pain and despair, a final figure appeared on the beach. This was Okuninushi, struggling under the weight of his brother's luggage, sweating from exertion, humble where they had been haughty. He saw the rabbit and immediately set down his burdens. "Poor creature," he said, his voice gentle as rain after drought. "What has happened to you?" The rabbit, through tears and agony, told its story again, including the cruel advice of the 80 brothers. Okuninushi's face darkened with anger at his brother's cruelty, but his voice remained kind. "They have lied to you," he said simply. "Listen carefully. Go to the river mouth, where fresh water meets the sea. Bathe there, washing away all the salt. Then gather the pollen of kama grass and roll in it. The pollen will stick to your skin, become like fur, and ease your pain." The rabbit, though barely able to move, heard truth in this voice, where it had heard mockery in others. It crawled to the river mouth, each movement agony, but the fresh water, when it touched the rabbit's skin, was like the first mercy it had ever known. The salt washed away, and with it, some of the burning. The kama grass grew thick by the riverside, its pollen golden in the afternoon sunday. The rabbit rolled in it, and wherever the pollen touched, the pain eased. The pollen clung like fur, like hope, like the possibility of healing. The rabbit's breathing, which had been ragged with pain, became steady with relief. But then something extraordinary happened. The rabbit began to change. Its shape shifted, grew, transformed. Where a rabbit had lain, a deity stood. For this had been no ordinary rabbit, but a divine messenger, the rabbit of Inaba. Testing the hearts of those who had caught Princess Yakami, Okuninushi, the deity said, its voice now carrying the authority of heaven's judgment. Your brothers seek Princess Yakami's hand, but they will not win it. She will choose you, for you have shown that true nobility lies not in birth or power, but in compassion for the suffering of others. The prophecy hung in the air, like the sound after a bell stops ringing. Present but invisible, Okuninushi stood stunned, unable to speak, still processing that he had been addressing not just a rabbit but a divine test. Moreover, the rabbit of Inaba continued, you will face terrible trials. Your brothers will try to kill you, not once but twice. You will journey to the underworld and back. You will steal from gods and marry their daughters. But in the end, you will become the ruler of all the land, the great master your name proclaims you to be. With that, the deity vanished, leaving only the impression of its presence in the sand and the echo of its prophecy in the air. Okuninushi stood alone on the beach, his brother's luggage scattered around him, his future suddenly vast and terrifying. When he finally caught up with his brothers at Princess Yakami's palace, they were preening like peacocks, each proclaiming his own superiority, each certain of victory. The sound of their boasting was like crows arguing over carrion, harsh and meaningless. But when Princess Yakami emerged to make her choice, her eyes passed over all 80 brothers, as if they were furniture. Her gaze found Kuninushi, still dusty from the road, still humble from service, and she spoke with a voice clear as temple bells. This one. I choose this one. The sound of 80 brothers' jaws dropping in unison was like a percussion section falling downstairs. Their rage, when it came, was like thunder gathering for a storm that would break not in rain, but in murder. Section 11. Kuninushi's Trials. The sound of jealousy sharpening its knives. The 80 brothers smiled at Okuninushi, with teeth like knives and eyes like poison. Their congratulations sounded like curses wrapped in silk. Their embraces felt like nooses being measured. They had lost Princess Yakami to their baggage carrier, and for that humiliation, only blood would suffice. Come, beloved brother, they said, their voices sweet as honey hiding hemlock. Let us go hunting to celebrate your engagement. We know a place where the boars are fat and numerous. They led him to Mount Heba, where the slopes were steep as suspicion and the forests thick as plots. At the mountain's base, they positioned Okuninushi with a net, telling him to wait while they drove down game from above. When you see the red boar, they instructed, you must catch it. It is the finest game on this mountain, and capturing it will prove you worthy of Princess Yakami. Okuninushi waited, listening to his brothers climb the mountain, their footsteps fading into distance, their laughter echoing like warnings he didn't heed. The forest was quiet around him, that particular quiet that comes before catastrophe, when even birds know to flee. Then he heard it, a roaring, rumbling sound from above, like thunder made solid and rolling downhill. Through the trees came something red and massive, moving with terrible speed. But this was no boar. The brothers had heated a huge boulder until it glowed red as rage, then rolled it down the mountain. Kuninushi, faithful to his brother's instructions, stepped forward to catch what he thought was the red boar. The moment his hands touched the superheated stone, his flesh sizzled like meat on a grill. The sound of divine flesh burning is particular and wrong, like stars screaming. He embraced the boulder, trying to stop it, and it burned through him, into him, until he fell dead, his body charred beyond recognition. The brothers' laughter echoed down the mountain, the sound of satisfied cruelty. They left him there, carrion for crows, and returned to tell Princess Yakami that her chosen one had failed even at simple hunting. But the universe has ways of correcting certain wrongs, and Okuninushi's death reached ears that mattered. His mother, Sashikuni Wakahime, felt her son's death like a blade in her heart. Her wail of grief reached heaven itself, where Kamimusibi, one of the primal creation gods, heard and took pity. Kamimusibi sent Kisagai Hime, the cockleshell princess, and Umugi Hime, the clam princess, to the mortal realm. Picture these two deities descending like marine mist, carrying the sound of the life-giving ocean with them. Kisagai Hime ground herself into powder, creating a divine salve. Umugi Hime mixed this with her sacred waters, creating a paste that could restore even the dead. They spread this mixture over Okuninushi's charred body, singing songs that sounded like tides bringing life to barren shores. Where the paste touched, flesh reformed. Where their songs reached, spirit returned. Okuninushi drew breath like a drowning man finding air, gasping back to life with the sound of resurrection itself. Be wary of your brothers, the shell princesses warned before departing. Their jealousy is not satisfied. But Okuninushi, perhaps too good for his own good, returned to his brothers, believing their tears of surprise were tears of joy. They embraced him with arms that measured him for another grave. A miracle, they proclaimed. We must celebrate. Come, we will build a new storehouse for your wedding gifts. They went to a great forest, where ancient trees grew straight, as honor should be but rarely is. The brothers cut a massive tree, splitting it with wedges, creating a gap in the trunk large enough for a man to enter. Look inside, brother, they said. Help us measure if this will be large enough for all the treasures Princess Yakami will bring. The moment Okuninushi entered the split trunk, they knocked out the wedges. The tree snapped closed, with a sound like the world's largest jaw chomping shut. Okuninushi was crushed, his divine essence squeezed out like juice from a grape. He died again, this time pulverized rather than burned. Again his mother felt his death. Again she petitioned heaven. Again he was restored, this time by Kamimusibi directly, who descended with the sound of cosmic disappointment at mortals' capacity for cruelty. Your brothers will kill you as many times as you let them, his mother said, weeping over her twice-resurrected son. Flee. Go to Susanoo, in Neino Katasukuni, the land of roots. He is terrible, but perhaps one terrible god can protect you from 80 cruel ones. So, Okuninushi fled, travelling to the entrance of the underworld, though not the Yomi where dead things rot, but Neino Katasukuni, the root land where Susanoo had made his palace after his redemption. The entrance was a cave that breathed cold air and strange sounds, like the earth talking in its sleep. As he descended, the path grew stranger. Tree roots hung from above like frozen waterfalls. Mushrooms glowed with light that shouldn't exist. Water ran upward. The sound down here was muffled, as if the world above was just a dream the underworld was having. Susanoo's palace was magnificent in its strangeness, built from materials that didn't exist in the upper world, stones that hummed, wood that never had been trees, metals that remembered being stars. And at its gate stood someone who made Okuninushi forget every hardship he had endured. This was Suserihime, Susanoo's daughter, beautiful as her father was terrible, gentle as her father was violent. When her eyes met, Okuninushi's, the sound was like two tuning forks finding perfect harmony. They loved immediately and completely, the kind of love that makes gods do foolish things. You must flee, she whispered urgently. My father will kill you. I have nowhere else to go, Okuninushi replied. And now, having seen you, nowhere else I want to be. Before more could be said, Susanoo himself appeared, massive and terrible, his presence making the air itself grow heavy. He looked at Okuninushi with eyes that had seen the worst of heaven and earth, and had been the cause of much of it. So, Susanoo rumbled, his voice like distant thunder, a young god comes seeking sanctuary, or perhaps seeking my daughter. Either way, you must prove yourself worthy. He led Okuninushi to a chamber filled with snakes, their hissing like 1,000 voices, whispering death. "Sleep here tonight," Susanoo commanded. "If you survive, we will speak in the morning." But Suserihime had already given Okuninushi a scarf, one of her own divine garments. When he waved it, the snakes became docile as earthworms, their hissing changing to something almost like purring. He slept peacefully, while serpents coiled around him like living blankets. The next night, Susanoo put him in a room full of centipedes and wasps, their buzzing and clicking like an army of tiny swords being sharpened. Again, Suserihime's scarf tamed them, and Okuninushi slept to the lullaby of pacified poison. Frustrated, Susanoo tried a different approach. He shot an arrow into a vast field of dry grass and commanded Okuninushi to retrieve it. The moment Okuninushi entered the field, Susanoo set it ablaze. The sound of divine fire eating grass is like appetite itself, given voice, hungry and unstoppable. But a field mouse, one of those creatures that know the secret ways of the earth, called out to Okuninushi, "The inside is hollow, the outside is narrow." Following this cryptic advice, Kuninushi found a hole where the ground was hollow beneath but narrow at the entrance. He hid underground while fire raged above, the sound of inferno passing over him like death passing over a hidden life. When he emerged, unburned, and carrying not only the arrow but also additional arrows the mouse had given him, Susanoo's frustration turned to something like respect. Perhaps this young god was worthy after all. That night, Susanoo invited Okuninushi to groom his hair, a sign of acceptance. As Okuninushi worked, he found that Susanoo's hair was full of centipedes, placed there as one final test. But Okuninushi cleverly plucked berries and clay, pretending to pull out and eat the centipedes, while actually disposing of them. Susanoo, soothed by the grooming and fooled by the deception, fell into divine sleep, his snoring like earthquakes taking naps. This was the moment. Okuninushi quietly tied Susanoo's hair to the palace rafters, each knot careful and strong. He took Susanoo's sword, his bow and arrows, and his koto, the heavenly harp whose music could charm even stones. Most importantly, he took Suserihime, carrying her on his back as they fled. The koto, jostled in their escape, rang out a note that shook the underworld. Susanoo woke with a roar that made mountains tremble in the world above. He tried to pursue, but was held by his own hair. By the time he tore free, pulling down half his palace in the process, the fleeing couple had reached the border between the underworld and earth. Standing at that border, Susanoo called out, and his voice carried not rage, but something unexpected. Approval. "You have stolen from me fairly," he bellowed, and his laughter was like storms breaking into sunshine. "You have won my daughter through cleverness and courage. Take my weapons and treasures. With them, defeat your brothers and become Okuninushi truly, the great master of the land. Build your palace with pillars that reach the heavens and foundations that touch the underworld." His blessing echoed across the realms, making it divine law. Okuninushi returned to the world above with a god's daughter as his wife, and a storm god's blessing as his shield. The 80 brothers, when they saw him coming with Susanoo's weapons and bride, scattered like leaves before a typhoon. They would never trouble him again. Section 12. The medicine god and nation building, the sound of civilization taking its first breath. Okuninushi stood on the shores of Izumo, master of the land, as prophecy had foretold. But ruling emptiness is no rule at all. The Japan of those days was wild and harsh, barely distinguished from the primordial chaos that preceded creation. Diseases ravaged populations, wounds festered without cure, and humans lived brief, painful lives, their cries echoing across untamed lands. It was then that the waves themselves brought an unexpected gift. Picture this scene. Kuninushi, walking along the beach at dawn, the sound of waves regular as breathing, when suddenly something disturbed the rhythm. A tiny boat, no larger than a seed pod, washed ashore. It was made from the skin of a water bird, sewn with impossible skill, and inside sat a god so small he could dance on a fingertip. This was Sukunabi Kona, whose size belied his significance. He wore robes made from moth wings and spoke with a voice like wind through tiny bells. When Okuninushi asked his name and origin, the tiny god remained silent, but his eyes sparkled with knowledge vast as oceans. A passing scarecrow, one of those beings that exists between animate and inanimate, whispered to Okuninushi, "This is the child who slipped between Kamimusibi's fingers during creation, falling to earth like a seed that would grow into something unexpected." Kamimusibi, when consulted, confirmed this, adding, "He is my errant child, small in body, but great in knowledge. Together, you two must build the nation, establish medicine, and protect the people from seen and unseen harms." The partnership between Okuninushi and Sukunabi Kona was like the marriage of strength and wisdom, earth and ingenuity. Where Okuninushi could move mountains, Sukunabi Kona could see the patterns in how mountains should be moved. Where Okuninushi could command respect through power, Sukunabi Kona could cure ailments that power couldn't touch. Together, they walked the length and breadth of Japan, and wherever they went, transformation followed. Listen to the sounds of nation building, the crack of rocks being split to make roads, the bubble of hot springs being opened to heal the sick, the whisper of seeds being planted that would grow into rice fields that would feed millions. Sukunabi Kona introduced the art of medicine, though medicine in those days meant understanding the sacred balance between body and spirit, earth and heaven. He taught humans which plants could cure fever, their leaves rustling with healing potential. He showed them which minerals could draw out poison, their crystalline structures singing with purifying power. When they came to places where the earth's heat rose close to the surface, Sukunabi Kona would dance, his tiny feet creating patterns that opened hot springs. The first onsen bubbled up with sounds like the earth laughing, warm and welcoming. These springs didn't just clean bodies but purified spirits, creating spaces where the boundary between mortal and divine grew thin and healing. "See," Sukunabi Kona explained in his tinkling voice, "illness comes from imbalance. Too much heat brings fever, too much cold brings stiffness, too much dampness brings rot, too much dryness brings withering. The cure is not to fight these forces but to balance them." They established the practice of brewing medicine, teaching humans to extract the essence of healing from nature's bounty. The sound of mortars grinding herbs, of decoctions bubbling over careful fires, of healers chanting the proper words to activate remedies, all these began during their partnership. But Sukunabi Kona's greatest gift was teaching that prevented illness rather than curing it. He established rituals of cleanliness, showing people how to purify water, how to properly dispose of waste, how to recognize which foods had turned dangerous. The sound of pure water being poured for ceremonial washing, that particular splash that even today begins every shrine visit, originated from his teachings. Okuninushi, meanwhile, focused on the larger structures of civilization. He taught irrigation, showing people how to channel water's power without being destroyed by it. The first irrigation channels sang as they filled, bringing life to dry fields. He established laws, not harsh edicts but agreements that let communities live in harmony. The sound of the first village councils, voices raised in debate, then lowered in consensus. These were his gifts. Together, they faced the monsters and demons that plagued early Japan. When a giant serpent poisoned a river, Sukunabi Kona created an antidote, while Okuninushi wrestled the beast into submission. When plague spirits descended like invisible locusts, Sukunabi Kona taught the people to burn specific herbs, whose smoke drove the spirits away, while Okuninushi built sacred barriers that the plague couldn't cross. They established the kunizukuri, the making of the land, which was both literal and metaphorical. Literally, They pulled islands from the sea, O-Kuninushi hauling on cosmic ropes, while Sukunabikona directed the placement. The sound of new land rising from water is indescribable, like birth and earthquake and miracle combined. Metaphorically, they were creating the idea of nation itself, teaching scattered tribes that they were part of something larger. For years uncounted, this partnership flourished. Japan transformed from wilderness to civilization, from chaos to order, from suffering to healing. The people sang songs of the great landmaster and his tiny companion, melodies that echoed from the northern snows to the southern seas. But nothing, not even divine partnerships, lasts forever. One day, as they stood in a field of grain that whispered prosperity, Sukunabikona climbed a stalk of millet. When he reached the top, the stalk, bent by his tiny weight, suddenly sprang back, catapulting him into the sky. But instead of falling back to earth, he kept going, rising higher and higher, his tiny form disappearing into the blue. My work here is complete. His voice drifted down like falling cherry blossoms. I return to the eternal land, to Tokoyo no Kuni, where neither time nor death exist. Continue our work, O Kuninushi. Build the nation, heal the people, make the land worthy of the gods who will come after. The sound of O Kuninushi's grief was like mountains weeping, deep and resonant, and seemingly endless. He called out to his tiny friend, but only echoes answered. He climbed the highest peaks, descended to the deepest valleys, searched the furthest islands. But Sukunabikona had returned to that mysterious eternal land from which there was no returning. Alone now, O Kuninushi continued their work. He established more shrines, teaching people how to properly honor the kami that lived in every rock, tree, and stream. He refined the medical knowledge Sukunabikona had introduced, ensuring it would be passed down through generations. The sound of students reciting medicinal properties, of healers grinding herbs, of hot springs bubbling with curative power, all these continued as echoes of their partnership. But O Kuninushi knew, with the wisdom that comes from loss, that his time as ruler was not eternal. He had built the nation, established medicine, created civilization from wilderness. Soon, the heavenly gods would send their own representative to rule, and he would need to decide whether to resist or yield. In preparation, he built his great shrine at Izumo, a structure so magnificent that its pillars really did reach toward heaven, just as Susanoo had commanded. The sound of its construction was like the earth itself, learning architecture, massive trees being felled and shaped, foundation stones being set deeper than roots, sacred spaces being defined by walls and intention. When the shrine was complete, O Kuninushi stood in its innermost sanctuary and spoke to the darkness that would soon need to yield to heavenly light. I have made this land from nothing. I have healed its people, fed its hunger, tamed its wildness. When heaven comes to claim it, they will find not chaos but civilization, not wilderness but nation. This is my gift to creation, a land worthy of gods and humans alike. His words echoed through the shrine and across the land, a declaration and a promise, a farewell and a foundation. The age of earthly gods was ending. The age of heaven's mandate was about to begin. But that transition, that cosmic passing of authority from earth to heaven, that negotiation between what was built and what was decreed, that is a tale for another breath, another rhythm, another movement in the endless dance of Japanese mythology. Section 13. The Heavenly Decree. The sound of heaven's court assembling like thunder, gathering its arguments. In Takamagahara, the plain of high heaven, Amaterasu sat in contemplation that had lasted for celestial ages. Below her, the lands that Izanagi and Izanami had created, that O Kuninushi had civilized, spread like a tapestry woven from mountains and rivers, forests and fields. The sound of mortal life rose to her like incense. Prayers and celebrations, sorrows and joys, the endless rhythm of human existence. But something was amiss in the cosmic order. The earthly realm was ruled by earthly gods, while heaven watched from above, separate and disconnected. The time had come, Amaterasu decided, to unite heaven and earth under singular divine authority. The sound of her decision was like sunrise itself, becoming conscious of its purpose. She called the assembly of 800 myriad gods, and they gathered in the dry bed of heaven's river, their combined presence making the air itself ring like a struck bell. Deities of every aspect of existence attended, gods of wind and water, goddesses of weaving and warfare, the ancient ones who remembered creation's first moments, the younger ones who would carry its future. The central land of reed plains, Amaterasu announced, her voice carrying the authority of the sun itself, has been made rich and prosperous by Okuninushi, but it is time for heaven's direct rule. I shall send one of my children to govern from there. The assembly murmured agreement, the sound like wind through infinite leaves. But which child to send? This question would prove more complex than anyone anticipated. First, Amaterasu chose her eldest son, Amanushi Homimi, he whose birth from the jewels had proven Susanoo's intentions. But when Amanushi Homimi stood at the edge of heaven and looked down at the earthly realm, he saw chaos that Amaterasu's distant gaze had not perceived. The earthly deities were not simply accepting heaven's decree, but actively debating, arguing, some preparing for resistance. The sound rising from below was not submission but tumult. "Mother," Amanushi Homimi reported, his voice uncertain as morning mist. "The land below seethes with unruly gods. They rage and debate like flies buzzing over summer meat. I cannot descend into such chaos." His refusal echoed through heaven like the sound of breaking precedent. Never before had a direct command from Amaterasu been declined. The goddess, though displeased, recognized the truth in her son's observation. The earth would need to be pacified before heaven could rule it. "Then we shall send messengers," she declared, "to negotiate with Okuninushi and prepare the way." The first messenger chosen was Amenohohi, a god of grain and good fortune. He descended with ceremony, his passage marked by falling stars that mortals would later call good omens. But when he reached the earthly realm and met Okuninushi, something unexpected happened. Instead of delivering heaven's message, Amenohohi was charmed by the earthly god's nobility, impressed by what had been built without heaven's help. The sound of his loyalty shifting was like grain stalks bending to face a different Sunday. 3 years passed. Heaven heard nothing. When divine scouts were sent to investigate, they found Amenohohi serving Okuninushi, having completely forgotten his mission, teaching agriculture, with no mention of heaven's claim. He had, in essence, defected. The second messenger was Amawakahiko, young and proud, armed with heaven's own bow and arrows that never missed their mark. He descended with the sound of certainty itself, sure that he would not fail where Amenohohi had. But when he reached Earth, he met Shitateru Hime, Okuninushi's daughter, whose beauty was like moonlight given form, whose voice was like water, teaching stones how to sing. Amawakahiko fell in love instantly and completely, the kind of love that makes gods forget they are gods. He married her, built a palace, and began to dream not of serving heaven, but of ruling earth himself. The bow and arrows of heaven gathered dust in his hall, while he played husband and would-be king. 8 years passed. Heaven's patience, vast as it was, began to fray. The sound of divine irritation is like the grinding of continental plates, slow but inevitable. Finally, the gods sent a divine pheasant, Nakime, to investigate. This bird, whose cry could pierce the veil between realms, perched on a tree outside Amawakahiko's palace and called out heaven's demand for answers. Inside, Amenosugume, a deity who served the wayward messenger, heard the bird, and recognized its divine nature. "My lord," she whispered to Amo Wakahiko, "that bird's cry carries heaven's accusation. It calls you traitor." Amo Wakahiko, his pride stung and his new earthly ambitions threatened, took up the dusty bow of heaven and shot the pheasant through the heart. The arrow, being divine, didn't stop at killing the bird. It continued upward, piercing through the boundaries between realms, and landed at the feet of Amaterasu herself, still stained with the pheasant's blood. The sun goddess picked up the arrow, and her reading of its story was instant and complete. The blood told of betrayal. The trajectory told of murderous intent. The very wood of the shaft whispered of oaths broken and loyalty discarded. "If Amo Wakahiko shot this arrow at enemies of heaven," she said, her voice cold as the space between stars, "let it do him no harm. But if he shot it with treachery in his heart, let this very arrow be his doom." She cast the arrow back down to earth, and it found Amo Wakahiko as he lay sleeping beside his earthly bride. The sound of divine justice is swift and sharp, like lightning finding the tallest tree. The arrow pierced his heart, and he died instantly, his dreams of earthly rule ending in the space between one breath and the next that never came. His funeral was the first divine funeral on earth, attended by both heavenly and earthly gods, a strange mixing of realms in shared grief. Shitateru Haim's weeping could be heard in heaven itself, the sound of love discovering that even divine marriage cannot prevent death when justice demands it. Finally, heaven sent not one messenger, but two. Takamikazuchi, the god of thunder and swords, whose birth from Kagutsuchi's blood made him fierce beyond measure, and Futsunushi, the god of military might. They descended not with diplomacy, but with power, their arrival announced by thunder that made mountains bow and lightning that turned night briefly into day. They didn't go directly to Okuninushi, but stopped at the beach of Inasa, planting Takamikazuchi's sword upside down in the sand and sitting on its hilt in the air, a display of power that defied both gravity and reason. The sound of their summons was not a request but a command, rolling across the land like the promise of storm. When Okuninushi arrived, he saw these messengers and understood immediately that negotiation had been replaced by ultimatum. Takamikazuchi's voice was like swords being sharpened when he spoke. The sun goddess declares that all lands between heaven and the underworld belong rightfully to her descendants. You have ruled well, O Kuninushi, but your time is ending. Will you yield peacefully, or must heaven take by force what it claims by right? Section 14. Ninigi's Descent. The sound of clouds parting like curtains before divinity. While Takamikazuchi and Futsunushi negotiated Earth's surrender, heaven prepared for its triumph. Amaterasu had chosen the heir who would rule the earthly realm, not her reluctant son Amanushi Homimi, but his son, her grandson, Ninigi. His full name rang like a declaration of abundance. Ame Nigishi Kuni Nigishi, Amatsu Hidaka Hiko Ho no Ninigi no Mikoto, the prince who prospers in heaven and earth. Heavenly High Sun Prince Rice Ear, abundance. Picture Ninigi in those days of preparation, young by divine standards, eager where his father had been reluctant, seeing opportunity where others saw only responsibility. The sound of his laughter was like summer grain rustling with promise. His footsteps rang with certainty that youth provides and age questions. Amaterasu summoned him to her presence in the innermost sanctuary of heaven, where light was not seen but felt, where the fundamental forces of existence converged. The sound here was like the universe's heartbeat, deep and constant, and absolutely foundational. "Grandson," she said, and her voice carried the weight of all creation's hopes. "You will descend to the central land of reed plains. You will rule there not as a conqueror, but as a bridge between heaven and earth. You will establish a line that will endure until the sun itself grows cold." She presented him with 3 treasures, each one containing power beyond mortal comprehension. First came the Yata no Kagami, the 8-hand mirror that had drawn her from the cave, that could show truth through any deception. When Ninigi took it, he could see himself reflected not as he was, but as he could become, infinite possibilities spreading like light through prism. Second came the Yasakani no Magatama, the string of jewels that had created the gods during Susanoo's contest. Each bead hummed with creative force, the power to make and unmake, to bless and curse, to bind heaven and earth in sacred contract. When worn, they made sounds like the cosmos whispering its secret names. Third came the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword that Susanoo had pulled from the Orochi's tail. Its blades sang of monsters' death and redemption earned, of chaos conquered and offered in apology. This sword could cut through anything: flesh, spirit, the bonds of fate itself. These three treasures, Amaterasu instructed, are not mere symbols but actual fragments of heaven's authority. Guard them as you would guard existence itself. They will legitimize your rule and your descendants' rule until time ends. She assigned him a retinue of gods to accompany his descent. Amenuzume, who had danced heaven back to light, would go to bring joy and celebration to the earthly realm. Ameno Tajikarao, who had pulled the boulder from the cave, would provide strength when strength was needed. Ishikaridome, maker of the sacred mirror, would establish proper worship. Tamanoya, creator of the jewels, would ensure prosperity. Most importantly, she assigned 5 clan chiefs to accompany him, gods who would become the ancestors of Japan's noble families, establishing not just divine rule, but divine bureaucracy, the intersection of heaven's will and earthly administration. The descent began at dawn, though dawn in heaven is not like earthly sunrise, but rather the moment when possibility becomes actuality. Ninigi and his retinue stood at the floating bridge of heaven, the same bridge where Izanagi and Izanami had stirred creation into being. Below, clouds covered the earth like a blanket of white mystery. Part, Ninigi commanded, and his voice, though young, carried his grandmother's authority. The clouds obeyed, splitting apart with sounds like silk tearing on cosmic scale. Through the opening, the earth appeared, green and blue and beautiful, waiting for heaven's touch. But as they prepared to descend, a strange god appeared at the crossing of heaven and earth, at that liminal space where up meets down. This deity was unlike any they had seen, taller than tall, with a nose 7 hands long, eyes that glowed like mirrors reflecting fire, and light shining from his mouth and rear. The sound of his presence was like roads converging, like all paths meeting at a single point. The divine retinue hesitated, uncertain whether this was guardian or enemy. Finally, Amenuzume, still bold from her cave dance, approached the strange deity. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Who stands at the boundary between realms?" The strange god's voice was like the echo of every traveller who had ever walked a path. "I am Saru Tahiko, the earthly deity of crossroads and guidance. I have come not to block heaven's descent, but to guide it. The paths between heaven and earth are treacherous for those who don't know the way. Let me lead you to the place prepared for heaven's grandchild." It was an unexpected offer, an earthly god helping heaven claim the earth. But Amenuzume, looking into his strange bright eyes, saw truth there. She reported back to Ninigi, who accepted the guidance, understanding that even heaven's triumph needed earth's cooperation. The descent itself was magnificent beyond description. Picture a column of light stretching from heaven to earth, wide as a mountain, bright as concentrated dawn. Within this light, Ninigi and his retinue descended, their forms visible as shadows within brilliance, like figures walking inside the Sunday. They landed on Mount Takachiho, in Himuka, what mortals would later call Kyushu, where the morning sun first touches Japan. The moment Ninigi's feet touched earthly soil, the mountain itself rang like a bell struck by divinity. Birds fell silent, winds stilled, even the insects paused their buzzing, as all existence acknowledged that something fundamental had changed. Sarutahiko had chosen the location well. From this peak, Ninigi could see the curve of the earth, the spread of lands he would rule, the distant sea that bordered his domain. The sound of his first breath of earthly air was like heaven, learning how to be mortal, divine lungs filling with the mixture of dust and dreams that humans breathe. This land, Ninigi declared, his voice carrying to all 8 corners of the earthly realm, is good. From here, I can see where the sun rises over the sea, where it sets behind the mountains. Here I will build my palace, here establish heaven's earthly throne. The construction of this first heavenly palace on earth created sounds never heard before. Divine architecture manifesting in mortal realm, pillars of celestial wood taking root in earthly soil, roofs that remembered the floors of heaven reaching towards skies they had once looked down upon. Section 15. The Flower Princess Choice. Wind through cherry blossoms, carrying the scent of fateful decisions. After establishing his palace, Ninigi took to walking his new realm, learning the feeling of earth beneath divine feet, the way mortal air moved differently than heaven's atmosphere. It was on one such walk, following a stream that babbled secrets only water knows, that he encountered her. She stood by the water, and her beauty was not the terrible perfection of goddesses, but something more subtle, more moving, beauty that knew it would fade, which made it all the more precious. This was Konohana Sakuya Hime, whose name means Princess of the Flowering Trees, and when she moved, it was with the grace of cherry blossoms dancing in spring wind. The sound of Ninigi's heart, recognizing its match, was like thunder so distant it might be mistaken for drums. He approached her, and for the first time since descending from heaven, felt uncertain. In heaven, everything was eternal and clear. Here, in this moment by the stream, everything was temporary and mysterious. "Who are you?" he asked, and his divine voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth and sudden emotion. "I am daughter of Ahoya Matsumi, the mountain god," she replied, her voice like wind chimes made from flower petals. "I am Konohana Sakuya Hime, and I bloom in spring." That last phrase carried weight beyond its simple meaning. She bloomed in spring, which meant she would also fade, as all flowers must. She was declaring her nature, beautiful but temporary, precious but not eternal. Ninigi didn't care. Love, when it strikes gods, strikes absolute. "Marry me," he said, diplomacy forgotten, divine dignity abandoned for direct desire. Konohana Sakuya Hime blushed, the colour in her cheeks like dawn touching mountain snow. "You must ask my father," she said, though her eyes said yes before permission was sought. Ahoya Matsumi, when Ninigi found him, was overwhelmed by the honour of heaven seeking marriage with his daughter. The mountain god's joy made his peaks tremble with pleasure, small avalanches of happiness tumbling down his slopes. But he made an unexpected decision. "I give you not one daughter but 2, he declared. "Take both Konohana Sakuya Hime and her older sister Iwanaga Hime." When Iwanaga Hime appeared, the contrast with her sister was stark. Where Konohana Sakuya Hime was delicate as blossoms, Iwanaga Hime was solid as stone. Where the younger sister moved like wind, the older moved like mountains, slowly, deliberately, eternally. Her name meant Princess of Eternal Rocks, and her beauty was the beauty of cliffs and boulders, massive, enduring, but not immediately appealing. Ninigi looked at the 2 sisters, and his choice was instant and unconsidered. "I thank you for your generosity," he told Ahoya Matsumi, "but I choose only Konohana Sakuya Hime. Send Iwanaga Hime back to your halls." The sound of Iwanaga Hime's rejection was like stone cracking in winter cold. Sharp, sudden, echoing. She left without word, but her eyes promised consequences, for spurned divinity never goes unpunished. Ahoya Matsumi's joy curdled into disappointment. His voice, when he spoke, rumbled like earthquakes of sorrow. "Foolish prince of heaven, I offered you both daughters for a reason. Konohana Sakuya Hime would give your life beauty and joy. Yes, but brief as cherry blossoms. Iwanaga Hime would have given your life the endurance of stone, the permanence of mountains. Together, they would have made your line both glorious and eternal. Now, having chosen only the flower, you and your descendants will bloom brilliantly but briefly. You have chosen beauty over eternity. The curse settled over Ninigi like frost over flowers, invisible but deadly. In that moment, the imperial line of Japan received its defining characteristic. They would be divine but not immortal, blessed but not eternal, always carrying heaven's mandate, but within mortal frames that would age and die like the cherry blossoms they had chosen over stone. The wedding proceeded despite the curse, for love once declared by gods cannot be undeclared. But on the wedding night, Konohana Sakuya Hime came to Ninigi with unexpected news. I am already with child. Suspicion, ugly and unworthy but purely human, entered Ninigi's divine heart. They had only just met. How could she already carry life? The sound of divine jealousy is like perfect harmony, suddenly discovering a discordant note. Whose child? He asked, and the temperature in their wedding chamber dropped like winter, arriving in a single breath. Konohana Sakuya Hime's response was not tears or protests, but divine fury matching his suspicion. You doubt me? You who descended from heaven with such certainty, doubt the word of your chosen bride. Very well, I will prove the child's divinity. She built a doorless chamber of clay and wood, a structure with no exit once entered. When my time comes, she declared, her voice carrying the sound of absolute conviction, I will enter this chamber and set it ablaze. If the child is mortal, we will burn. If the child is yours, divine prince, we will emerge unscathed. Months later, when labor pains began, she kept her promise. She entered the doorless chamber, and as her birthing cries began, she set the structure on fire. The sound was terrifying, flames roaring, wood cracking, and through it all, the cries of childbirth. Ninigi and all the court watched in horror as the chamber burned, certain they were witnessing tragedy. But Konohana Sakuya Hime had spoken truth. From the flames emerged not one child but three, each one perfect, unburned, divine. First came Hodori, born when the fire was high, who would command the sea's bounty. Then came Huri, born when the fire was brightest, who would rule the mountain's gifts. Last came Hosuseri, born as the fire died, who would master the balance between. Mother and children emerged from the ashes of the chamber, proof absolute of divine parentage. But the damage was done. Trust, once broken even by momentary doubt, leaves scars that even divine love cannot fully heal. Section 16. The luck of the sea and mountains. The sound of brothers choosing different paths. The three sons of Ninigi and Konohana Sakuya Hime grew to manhood, carrying their parents' complicated legacy. Divine heritage, mortal limitations, and the memory of fire as their first cradle. Each developed his own relationship with the world, his own domain of mastery. Hoderi, the eldest, called Umisachi Hiko, or luck of the sea, found his calling in ocean's bounty. His fishing hook was blessed by the Dragon Kings themselves, never failing to catch whatever swam. When he cast his line, fish competed to be caught, knowing they would become part of divine sustenance. The sound of his success was the slap of full nets against boat sides, the gleam of scales in sunlight, the satisfied splash of divine fishing. Huri, the middle son, called Yamasachi Hiko, or luck of the mountains, mastered the forest's gifts. His bow never missed, his traps never emptied. His understanding of animal paths was perfect as instinct. When he hunted, it was not slaughter but sacred exchange, the forest offering its abundance to divine hands. The sound of his domain was the twang of bowstring, the rustle of undergrowth parting before certain steps, the last breath of prey given willingly to a worthy hunter. One day, Hori proposed an exchange that would set in motion events reaching to the dragon palace beneath the sea. "Brother," he said to Hoderi, "let us trade our luck for a day. You take my bow and hunt the mountains. I'll take your hook and try the sea." Hoderi resisted. The sound of his reluctance was like waves pulling back before tsunami, instinctive recognition of approaching catastrophe. But Hori persisted with the enthusiasm of those who don't know what they don't know, until finally, Hoderi agreed. The exchange was disaster from the start. Hoderi, master of tides and currents, found the forest alien and uncooperative. Animals heard him coming from miles away. His arrows flew true, but always missed by exactly the width of divine doubt. He returned empty-handed, frustrated but philosophical, the tools unharmed. Hori's failure was worse. Not only did he catch nothing, but he lost the sacred hook itself, a great fish. Perhaps knowing the hook didn't belong to these hands, took it and dove deep, breaking the line, carrying away not just a tool, but a brother's birthright. The sound of the line snapping was like fate itself breaking, sharp and irreversible. When the brothers met at day's end, Hoderi's rage was oceanic in scope. "Return my hook," he demanded, his voice like typhoons, gathering strength. "I'll make you a new one," Hori offered desperately. 10 new ones, 100, 1,000. He broke his own sword, forging hook after hook, each one perfect in craft but wrong in essence. Hoderi rejected them all, the sound of metal hitting ground like relationship itself being discarded. "I want my hook, not replacements." That hook was blessed by the sea itself. Without it, I am no longer master of the waves. Hori wandered the beach in despair, tears falling like rain that brings flood rather than growth. His crying attracted Shiotsuchi, the god of salt and tides, whose appearance was like foam given form, whose voice carried the wisdom of every wave that had ever broken on shore. "Why does a prince of heaven weep on my beach?" the salt god asked. When Hori explained his predicament, Shiotsuchi laughed, the sound like bubbles rising from impossible depths. "Your hook swims in the stomach of a fish in the palace of Watatsumi, the dragon king of the sea. If you would retrieve it, you must go there yourself. But how can I, a god of land and mountains, travel beneath the sea?" Shiotsuchi wove a basket from bamboo that had never known soil, only salt spray. The weaving sounded like possibilities being knotted into certainty. "This basket will carry you between air and water, through the barrier that separates wet from dry. Descend, young prince, and trust in the currents to guide you." The journey down was like falling through liquid sky. Fish parted before him like clouds, their scales catching light that had no source, pressure that should have crushed instead embraced. The sound was all-encompassing, the heartbeat of the ocean itself, constant and ancient and absolutely alive. Rugujo, the dragon palace, appeared first as lights in the darkness, then as structures that shouldn't exist. Buildings made from single pearls, pillars of living coral that grew as he watched, roofs thatched with scales that rang like bells in the current. The sound of this underwater realm was music made from water itself, every movement a note, every gesture a chord. At the palace gate grew a cassia tree, its branches defying all logic by flowering underwater. Hori climbed into its branches to observe before announcing himself, a choice that would prove fateful. As he waited, he saw her, Toyotama Hime, the Dragon King's daughter, whose beauty transcended the boundary between human and divine, mortal and immortal, land and sea. When her servant came to draw water from the well beneath the tree, Hori expelled a jewel from his mouth, a trick of divine breath and intent. The jewel fell into the water jar with a sound like fate, clicking into place. The servant couldn't remove it, the jewel clinging to the vessel as if it belonged there. Toyotama Hime came to investigate this strange occurrence. Looking up, she saw Huri in the tree, and their eyes met through water that suddenly seemed clear as air. The recognition was instant and mutual, the sound of two hearts discovering they had been incomplete until that moment. "Father," she announced to Watatsumi, her voice carrying certainty that comes from love at first sight, "a son of heaven sits in our cassia tree." The Dragon King emerged from his throne room, massive and magnificent, scales that contained all colors of deep ocean, eyes older than land itself. His movement made the palace bells ring, each one a different note of welcome. "Prince Hori, grandson of Amaterasu, why does heaven honor the sea with its presence?" Huri descended and told his story, but his eyes never left Toyo Tamahime. The Dragon King listened with the patience of tides, understanding more than was spoken. "Your hook? A simple matter. But stay as my guest while we retrieve it. Surely you're not in such haste to return to the surface." Days in the Dragon Palace flowed like water, each one different yet the same. Hori and Toyo Tamahime fell deeper in love with each passing moment. They married with ceremonies that joined not just two hearts, but two realms, the sound of their vows echoing through ocean trenches and across abyssal plains. 3 years passed in Ryugu-jo, though time moves strangely in places where sun and moon are just rumors. Finally, Huri remembered his brother, still waiting on the beach, still angry about the hook. Guilt and duty stirred in his divine heart. When he announced his need to return, the Dragon King presented not just the hook, retrieved from the belly of a red tai fish, but 2 jewels, Shiomitsu Tama, the tide-raising jewel, and Shiohiru Tama, the tide-lowering jewel. "Your brother will still be angry," Watatsumi warned. "These will protect you from his wrath." Toyo Tamahime accompanied her husband to the surface, riding a great wani, its back broad as an island. But as they approached the beach, she spoke words heavy with divine necessity. "Husband, I am with child, your child. When my time comes, I will return to the shore. Build me a birthing hut, thatched with cormorant feathers. But know this, you must not look upon me when I give birth. No matter what you hear, do not look," Hori promised, though the request filled him with unease. He returned the hook to Hodori, but as predicted, his brother's anger remained. When Hodori attacked, Huri used the tide-raising jewel, and water rose to drown his brother. When Hodori begged for mercy, Hori used the tide-lowering jewel, saving him at the last moment. This cycle repeated until Hodori submitted, agreeing to serve his younger brother forever, establishing the divine order that younger could rule over elder, if heaven willed it. When Toyo Tamahime returned to give birth, Hori had built the requested hut, though he couldn't find enough cormorant feathers and had to thatch it with earth. The sound of incomplete preparation would prove prophetic. As his wife's labor cries began, curiosity overwhelmed divine promise. He peered through a gap in the thatching. What he saw broke both his heart and his understanding. Toyota Mahime, in the throes of childbirth, had reverted to her true form, a great dragon thrashing in pain and power, scales scraping against the hut's walls, divine birth happening in a form too terrible for heavenly eyes to bear. She knew instantly that he had looked. The sound of betrayal is like trust shattering, sharp and irreversible. After giving birth to Ugaya Fukiyazu, whose name meant unfinished thatching, in memory of broken promises, she fled to the sea, leaving only words that cut deeper than any sword. "You have shamed me as I was shamed by showing my true form. The path between sea and land is now closed. I cannot stay where trust is broken." She returned to Ryugu-jo, sending her sister to raise the child, maintaining connection but never again presence. The sound of the waves pulling away from that beach carried loss that would echo through all the generations of emperors to come, each one carrying heaven's mandate, but remembering the sea's sorrow. Section 17. The Dragon Princess's Secret. The sound of promises breaking like waves against immovable stone. The birthing hut stood on the beach of Himuka, incomplete in its thatching, a monument to haste and divine impatience. Inside, Toyotamahime laboured with the child who would bridge the age of gods and the age of emperors, her cries echoing across the boundary between land and sea, mortality and divinity. Picture Hori outside this hut, pacing in the sand, each footstep leaving impressions that filled immediately with seawater, as if the ocean itself was trying to reclaim him. The sound of his wife's pain cut through him like the sword he had broken to make hooks. Each cry a reminder that divine birth was still birth, sacred pain was still pain. He had promised not to look. The vow hung in the air like the smell of salt before a storm, present and heavy and impossible to ignore. But promises made in calm seas are tested in tempests, and curiosity, that fundamental flaw that had brought his aunt Izanami to look upon corrupted Izanagi, that had made Amaterasu peek from her cave, stirred in his breast like a serpent waking. The cormorant feathers he had managed to gather left gaps in the thatching, spaces where light leaked out and shadows danced within. Through one such gap, he saw movement that wasn't human, wasn't divine in any form he recognized. The sound from inside had changed too, no longer just cries of labor, but something deeper, more primal, like the ocean itself giving birth. Unable to resist, Hori pressed his eye to the gap. What he saw would forever change the nature of trust between the realms of sea and land. Toyotamahime had shed her human form like a kimono dropped to the floor. In its place writhed a dragon of impossible beauty and terrible power, scales that contained the colours of every depth of ocean, from shallow jade to abyssal black. Her dragon form was massive, coiled and contracting with the rhythms of birth, each movement making the hut's frame groan and crack. This was not transformation as deception, but transformation as truth. In her most vulnerable moment, giving birth to a child of mixed divine heritage, she had reverted to her essential nature. The sound of her true form was like the deep ocean speaking its secret name, vast and ancient, and absolutely other. The child emerged in a rush of waters that smelled of the deep places where light never reaches, where pressure creates diamonds and life takes forms that surface dwellers would call impossible. The baby's first cry harmonized with both dragon roar and human wail, a sound that belonged fully to neither realm, but somehow to both. In that moment of birth, Toyotamahime's dragon eyes, large as shields and deep as trenches, turned toward the gap where Hori watched. The recognition was instant. Her gaze held not anger, but something worse. The complete dissolution of trust, the knowing that what was sacred had been profaned by the very one who should have protected it. Her transformation back to human form was not the smooth shift of before, but jagged, painful, like being forced to wear clothes that no longer fit. When she stood, holding their newborn son, her beauty was intact but changed, like a perfect vase that has been broken and expertly repaired, but will never ring quite the same when struck. "You looked," she said, and her voice carried the weight of all the ocean's depth, pressure that could crush pearls back into sand. "Despite my warning, despite your promise, you looked upon my shame." Hori wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but what words could undo seeing? What apology could restore mystery once revealed? He stood silent, guilt making him heavy as the stones that sealed the underworld. "I name our son Ugayafuki Aiezu," Toyotamahime declared, cormorant feather thatching unfinished, so that his very name will carry the memory of promises broken, of divine trust betrayed. She walked past Hori toward the sea, carrying their son to the water's edge. The waves reached for her like old friends welcoming her home, each one whispering apologies for the land's betrayal. She kissed her son once, the sound like rain on still water, gentle and final. "I cannot stay where I have been shamed," she said, not turning to look at Hori. "The path between our realms, opened by love, is closed by broken trust. But I will not abandon our child entirely. She called out to the sea in the language of dragons, sounds that human throats could never make, like underwater thunder, like whales singing through stone. From the waves emerged another figure, similar to Toyota Mahime, but softer, less magnificent, but more approachable. My sister, Tamayoribime, Toyota Mahime said. She will raise our son. She will be the mother I cannot be, the bridge I can no longer form. Through her, some connection between sea and land may remain, though never again as it was. Tamayoribime took the infant, with arms that knew how to hold both dragon princes and human babies, her touch gentle as foam, strong as tides. She looked at Huri with eyes that held pity rather than judgment, understanding rather than condemnation. Toyota Mahime walked into the sea, each step taking her deeper, the water accepting her, like a door opening home. As she submerged, her form shifted one last time to dragon shape, visible for a moment as a vast shadow beneath the surface, before diving to depths where even divine eyes couldn't follow. The sound of her departure was like every love song ending in minor key, beautiful and sorrowful, and absolutely final. The sea itself seemed to mourn, waves coming in grey and listless for days afterward, as if the ocean had lost its reason to dance with the shore. Huri stood on that beach until the sun set and rose again, hoping for some sign of forgiveness, some indication that the path between realms might reopen. But the sea gave him only silence, the particular silence that follows when something precious has been lost through one's own failing. Tamayoribime raised Ugaya Fukiayezu with the patience of tides and the wisdom of depths. She taught him the songs of the sea and the laws of land, making him truly a child of both realms, even as those realms remained separated. The boy grew strong and noble, carrying his mother's dragon strength and his father's heavenly heritage, though he would sometimes stare at the ocean with longing he couldn't name. Hearing songs in the waves that almost made sense, almost sounded like a mother calling her child home. Section 18. The First Emperor's Birth. The sound of destiny taking its first breath. Ugaya Fukiayezu grew to manhood, carrying the complexity of his mixed heritage, like a banner only he could see. From his father, Hori, he inherited heaven's mandate and mountain strength. From his mother, Toyota Mahime, he carried the dragon's power and the sea's deep mysteries. From his aunt-mother, Tamayoribime, who raised him with patient tenderness, he learnt the balance between realms, the art of existing in spaces between definitions. When he came of age, the inevitable happened with the poetry that fate reserves for its favourite patterns. He fell in love with Tamayoribime, the woman who had raised him, who was his aunt by blood but his mother by devotion. The sound of this love recognizing itself was like echo answering original voice, similar but distinct, familiar but new. Their marriage was celebrated by both land and sea, though Toyota Mahime never emerged to witness it. The dragon princess sent gifts from the deep, pearls that glowed with their own light, coral that grew into whatever shape the holder wished, shells that whispered the secrets of currents. Each gift arrived on the tide with no messenger, just the sense of being watched by something vast and sorrowful beneath the waves. Tamayoribime bore Ugaya Fukiayezu 4 sons, each one containing the accumulated divinity of their complex lineage. Heaven's authority, earth's connection, sea's power, and something else, something new. They were gods, yes, but gods intended for a different age, an age where divinity would wear human face and walk among mortals, not as visitors, but as rulers. The eldest was Itseus, whose name meant valiant rice, strong as mountains and steady as stones. His voice when he spoke carried the authority of earth itself, making even rebellious gods listen. The second was Inahi, Ricefire, quick and clever, his mind sharp as the sword his great-great-grandmother had broken for hooks. his laughter bright as flames that had tested his grandmother's divinity. The third was Maikenu, August food. Generous and warm, beloved by all who met him, his presence like a feast that satisfied hunger people didn't know they carried. The youngest was Yamato Takeru, whose name would echo through all Japanese history, though he would be better known by his posthumous title, Jinmu, the Divine Warrior, the first human emperor of Japan. Even as an infant, there was something different about him. When he cried, which was rarely, the sound carried not distress but determination. When he laughed, listeners heard not just joy, but purpose. Picture these four brothers growing up on the shores of Himuka, where heaven had first touched earth through their grandfather Ninigi's descent. They trained in the arts of war and peace, learning to use both sword and poem, both strength and wisdom. The sound of their training was like the future teaching the present its requirements. The clash of wooden swords that would become steel, the recitation of laws that would become tradition, the practice of rituals that would become the essence of Japanese sovereignty. But as they grew, they also grew restless. Himuka, for all its divine significance, was at the edge of the world they knew. To the east lay the central lands, the great plains of Yamato, where legends said the heart of the world waited to be claimed. The brothers would gather on the beach at sunset, looking east toward lands they couldn't see but somehow felt calling to them. It was Yamato Takeru who first voiced what they all felt. We are sons of heaven, yet we sit at the edge of earth. Our ancestor Amaterasu rules the sky from heaven's center. Should not her descendants rule the earth from earth's center? The sound of divine ambition is like thunder before anyone sees lightning, potential gathering into intention. The brothers began to plan, to prepare, to dream of eastward expansion that would unite the scattered tribes and kingdoms under heaven's mandate. One night, Yamato Takeru had a dream that was more than dream. Amaterasu herself appeared to him, not as the gentle sun that warmed the earth, but as the blazing authority of heaven itself. Her voice in his dream was like being inside the sun, surrounded by light that spoke. Grandson of my grandson, your instinct is correct. The central land of Yamato awaits its true ruler. Go east, but know the path will not be easy. You will face gods who do not acknowledge heaven's authority, demons who feed on disorder, and your own mortality that your ancestors chose when they picked flower over stone. But if you persevere, you will establish a line that will rule until the sun no longer rises. When he woke, Yamato Takeru found something beside his sleeping mat, a bow that hummed with heavenly power and arrows that would always fly true. The message was clear. The time for the eastward expedition had come. Section 19. The Eastward Expedition. The sound of destiny marching toward its appointment. In the 45th year of Ugaya Fukiaezu's reign, when Yamato Takeru had reached the age where divine youth transforms into divine purpose, the four brothers assembled their forces for the Great Eastern Expedition. The sound of preparation filled Himuka, weapons being forged, provisions being gathered, men pledging their swords to heaven's cause. They departed on an auspicious day when the sun rose without clouds and the sea was calm as pooled mercury. Their fleet was not large by the standards of later naval forces, but significant for its time. Ships that knew the blessing of both sea dragons and heaven's winds, vessels that could navigate by starlight and divine intuition. The journey began with promise. They sailed along the inland sea that protected waterway between Honshu and Shikoku, where the waves were gentled by surrounding lands. At each landing, some local chiefs submitted to heaven's obvious mandate, recognizing in the brothers the divinity that separated ruler from ruled. The sound of these early victories was like dominoes falling in sequence, each submission making the next more likely. But as they moved deeper into the central lands, resistance stiffened. The local gods, the Kunitsukami who had ruled these lands since before heaven's descent, were not eager to yield their authority to newcomers, even newcomers with divine credentials. The sound of their resistance was like the earth itself saying, "No," landslides blocking paths, rivers flooding just as the brothers tried to cross, mysterious illnesses striking their forces. At Naniwa, near what mortals would later call Osaka, they faced their first serious military defeat. A local chieftain named Nagasunahiko commanded forces that knew the land like lovers know each other's breath. His arrows found gaps in divine armor. His strategies turned heaven's strength into weakness. In the battle, Itsu's, the eldest brother, took an arrow through his shield arm, the wound festering with poison that even divine blood couldn't cleanse. They retreated south, following the coast, the sound of their withdrawal like pride learning humility. Itsu's grew weaker with each day, his divine strength seeping out with blood that wouldn't stop flowing. Finally, at the mouth of the Key River, he spoke his last words. "I am a descendant of the sun, yet I fought with the sun at my face, attacking eastward. This is why heaven didn't protect me. You must go around, approach from where the sun supports rather than blinds you." With those words, Itsu's died, the first divine casualty of what would become Japan. His death rattle was like mountains sighing, great strength finally accepting defeat. They buried him overlooking the sea, where he could watch both sunrise and sunset, eternal guardian of the lesson learned through his loss. The expedition continued, but now they circled around the Key Peninsula, approaching Yamato from the south and east rather than the west. This route was harder, through mountains that scraped the sky and forests that had never known human footsteps. The sound of their passage was like civilization cutting its first path through primordial wilderness. It was in these mountains that disaster struck again. A local deity, angry at their intrusion, sent a strange mist that made men fall asleep where they stood, divine and mortal alike succumbing to supernatural torpor. Kamuyama Toiwebiko himself felt the drowsiness pulling at him, like the undertow of unconsciousness. His remaining brothers fell one by one, their snores mixing with the sound of approaching enemy forces. Just as all seemed lost, when the local warriors were about to slaughter the sleeping invaders, a miracle occurred. From the sky descended an enormous crow with 3 legs, the Yatagarasu, sent by Amaterasu herself. This was no ordinary bird, but a piece of the sun given wings. Its core like dawn itself, declaring war on sleep. The Yatagarasu's cry shattered the enchantment, waking the divine forces just in time to defend themselves. But more than that, the 3-legged crow became their guide through the trackless mountains. It would fly ahead, its divine nature finding paths where no paths seemed to exist, its core calling them forward when despair suggested surrender. Following the Yatagarasu, they descended into Yamato from the mountains, arriving like heaven's own avalanche, unexpected and unstoppable. The local forces, prepared for attack from the west, found themselves flanked from the east. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military one. These invaders had crossed impassable mountains, guided by heaven's own messenger. Surely their mandate was real. The sound of Yamato's submission was not the clash of final battle, but the whisper of recognition, the acceptance that comes when the inevitable is finally acknowledged. Chief after chief laid down arms, choosing to serve heaven's representative rather than resist heaven's will. But Nagasunahiko, who had killed Itsu's, remained defiant. He controlled the richest parts of Yamato and commanded the loyalty of those who saw the brothers not as divine rulers, but as foreign invaders. The final battle would be fought on the plains of central Yamato, where the future of Japan would be decided. Before the battle, Kamuyama Toiwebiko performed a ritual that would echo through centuries. He took clay from Mount Kagu, the sacred peak at Yamato's heart, and formed it into vessels for sacrifice. The sound of divine hands shaping earth into sacred purpose was like creation itself being reenacted, the first making of order from chaos replayed in miniature. The battle, when it came, was as much cosmic as military. The skies darkened with arrows. The earth trembled with charging feet. But at the crucial moment, when victory balanced on the edge of a sword, the Amaterasu landed on Yamato Takeru's bow. The three-legged crow blazed with light, borrowed directly from Amaterasu, illumination so bright that enemy forces were blinded, their arrows flying wide, their courage evaporating like dew before the true Sunday. Nagasunahiko's forces broke and fled. The chieftain himself disappeared into the mountains, some say still searching for a way to undo heaven's victory, others claiming he accepted defeat and served the new order in disguise. The sound of victory was like the future clicking into place, all the possibilities of Japan's history suddenly narrowing into one path forward. On the first day of spring in the year, mortals would much later call 660 BC, Yamato Takeru performed the ceremony that transformed mythology into history. At Kashihara, at the foot of Mount Unebi, he built the first imperial palace. Its construction sounds still echo, the placing of pillars that connected earth to heaven, the raising of roofs that sheltered divine authority, the establishment of spaces where gods and humans could coexist under unified rule. Standing in his new palace, wearing the regalia that connected him to Amaterasu, carrying the sword that had slain the Orochi, the mirror that had drawn the sun from her cave, the jewels that had created gods, Yamato Takeru spoke the words that ended the age of gods and began the age of emperors. I am Jinmu, first emperor of Japan, descendant of heaven, ruler of earth. From this center, like light from the sun, order will spread to all 8 corners of the world. The age of gods walking openly among humans ends. The age of humans carrying divine mandate begins. The sound of his proclamation was like the closing of one book and the opening of another, the final note of mythology becoming the first note of history. The gods withdrew to their shrines, the dragons retreated to the depths, the magical creatures faded into memory and story. But the imperial line remained, carrying heaven's blood in human veins, proof that once, in the morning of the world, gods and humans were family, and perhaps, in moments of festival and ritual, remained so still. Epilogue, echoes in eternity, living mythology, the sound of festival drums echoing across centuries. Walk through Japan today, in this modern age of bullet trains and smartphones, and listen carefully beneath the electronic melodies of convenience stores, behind the rush of traffic in Tokyo's endless streets. Under the conversations in coffee shops and offices, you can still hear them. The old gods, breathing. They live in the 10,000 torii gates that mark the boundaries between sacred and mundane, each one painted vermilion like the sunrise Amaterasu brings. Pass beneath one, and the sound changes, subtle but certain, like stepping from a noisy room into one where someone is praying. The kami are there, in every shrine from the Grand Ise Jingu, where Amaterasu herself resides, to the smallest roadside hokora, where forgotten gods of single rice paddies still receive offerings of sake and salt. Picture a matsuri, one of the countless festivals that punctuate the Japanese calendar, like divine punctuation marks. The sound begins days before, hammering as temporary stalls are erected, practice drums echoing from community centers, children rehearsing ancient songs whose words they don't fully understand but somehow feel in their bones. Then comes the day itself, and the streets transform into rivers of sound and movement. The mikoshi, portable shrines, are lifted onto shoulders of believers and bearers, their weight both physical and spiritual. Listen to the chant of washoi, washoi, rhythmic as heartbeat, old as the first time humans carried gods among them. The mikoshi sways and dips, the god inside taken on a journey through the modern world, showing them that their people remember, their stories continue, their presence still matters in an age that has forgotten so much else. At Izumo, in October, when all the gods gather for their annual conference, the absence is felt everywhere else in Japan. They call it Kanazuki, the month without gods, except in Izumo, where it becomes Kamiarizuki, the month with gods. The sound of 8 million deities discussing human fate is imagined but somehow heard, like whispers, just beyond the range of understanding, decisions being made that will echo through the coming year. The Imperial regalia, those 3 treasures that Ninigi brought from heaven, still exist, though wrapped in so much ceremony and secrecy that they have transcended physical reality to become pure symbol. The mirror rests at Ise, never seen by human eyes, not even the emperor's. The sword sleeps at Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, its presence felt more than observed. The jewels remain in the Imperial Palace, transferred from emperor to emperor in ceremonies so private that their exact nature is unknown to any but the imperial family and their closest priests. Yet their power persists, not in any magical sense, but in something perhaps more profound. The continuation of the world's oldest monarchy, an unbroken line stretching back to that beach where Jinmu first declared himself emperor. Every enthronement, the sound is the same, ancient words spoken in ancient cadences, connecting present to past with threads of ritual and recognition. Modern Japanese culture pulsates with mythological memory. In anime and manga, Susanoo battles new monsters with ancient fury. Amaterasu's light powers magical girls who fight darkness with brightness and hope. The Yamato no Orochi appears in video games, each head requiring different strategies to defeat, teaching new generations the old lesson that evil is complex and victory requires more than simple strength. Studio Ghibli's films shimmer with kami presence, forest spirits and river dragons, the bathhouse of the gods, where even the polluted spirit of a river can be cleansed and restored. The sound of these modern myths is different, electronic and processed. But the heartbeat beneath is the same rhythm that has pulsed through Japanese consciousness since gods first walked the land. In the Japanese language itself, mythology lives. The word for wife, okusan, means person in the back, echoing Izanami standing behind Izanagi as they stirred creation. Weddings still feature sansankudo, the 3x3 exchange of sake cups, remembering divine marriages and sacred numbers. The sound of everyday conversation carries divine etymology, each word a small shrine to stories that shaped a language. Even the landscape speaks mythology. Mount Fuji is not just a mountain, but the goddess Konohanasakuya Hime herself, beautiful and temporary, snow-capped beauty that blooms and fades with seasons. Every volcano remembers Kagutsuchi, the fire god whose birth brought death to creation. Hot springs bubble with the memory of Suku Nabikona's healing gift, their mineral-rich waters still drawing people seeking restoration of body and spirit. Rice, that foundation of Japanese civilization, carries Amaterasu's blessing in every grain. Watch a rice planting ceremony and see movements unchanged since heaven established agriculture. The sound of seedlings entering mud is the same splash that echoed in heaven's first paddies. The harvest festivals thank not abstract providence but specific gods with names and stories, personalities and preferences. The psychological truths embedded in these myths resonate even for those who claim no religious belief. The story of Amaterasu, hiding in the cave, speaks to everyone who has withdrawn from the world in pain, and the solution, laughter and curiosity drawing her out, offers wisdom about healing that no psychology textbook improves upon. Susanoo's rage and redemption tell every difficult child that transformation is possible, that destruction can become protection, that the very qualities that make us troubles can be redirected toward heroism. The tension between Ninigi's choice of the flower princess over the rock princess lives in every decision between beauty and permanence, passion and stability. Every parent watching their child leave home knows Izanagi's grief at losing Izanami, the terrible necessity of letting go, even when every instinct screams to hold on. The sound of these ancient stories is the sound of human experience, given divine form, elevated but not escaped, transformed but not transcended. Closing reflection. The sound of stories settling into eternal truth. Japanese mythology is unique among the world's great mythological traditions in its seamlessness, the way it flows from cosmic creation directly into historical chronicle without clear demarcation. There is no Ragnarok, no apocalypse, no final battle between good and evil that ends one age and begins another. Instead, there is transformation, gradual as dawn. Gods become ancestors, myths become history, the divine becomes the imperial, becomes the national, becomes the personal. This mythology gives us gods who are neither omnipotent nor omnibenevolent, but complex beings driven by emotions utterly recognizable to humans. Jealousy, grief, love, rage, curiosity, shame. Susanoo weeps for a mother he never knew. Amaterasu sulks when her feelings are hurt. O Kuninushi faces workplace harassment from his brothers. These are not distant, perfect beings demanding worship, but difficult relatives requiring patience, understanding, and occasionally careful management. The central role of pollution and purification in these stories speaks to something deep in human psychology, the need to acknowledge corruption while believing in the possibility of cleansing. Izanagi can wash away even the taint of death. Susanoo can transform from cosmic villain to heroic dragon slayer. The polluted river spirit can be restored to its pure form. The sound of running water in these stories is always the sound of hope, the possibility of starting fresh. Unlike mythologies that emphasize the transcendent, Japanese mythology is profoundly immanent. The divine is not distant but present in every stone, tree, waterfall, and grain of rice. This creates a religious sensibility that finds the sacred not by looking up to heaven or forward to afterlife, but by looking carefully at the present world, finding gods in the details, divinity in the mundane. The sound of everyday life becomes potentially sacred, each action a possible ritual, each object a potential shrine. The stories we've travelled through tonight, from the primordial stirring of creation to the establishment of the imperial line, are not mere entertainment or primitive explanations for natural phenomena. They are the software of a civilization, the organizing principles that taught a culture how to understand itself, how to relate to nature, how to conceive of authority, how to process grief and celebrate joy. They continue to evolve, these ancient stories, adapted in each generation to speak to new anxieties and possibilities. Environmental destruction becomes the rage of angry kami. Natural disasters are reminders that humans exist at the sufferance of forces far greater than themselves. The success of Japanese technology and industry is understood through the lens of Tsukunabikona's cleverness and Okuninushi's patient building. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these tales of gods and monsters, creators and destroyers, consider how mythology never really ends. It just transforms, like Toyotama Hime shifting between human and dragon form, presenting different faces to different ages, but always essentially itself. The sound of these stories will continue long after we who tell them now have joined our ancestors, because they speak to something in the human experience that transcends time and culture, while remaining distinctly, uniquely, eternally Japanese. The sun will rise tomorrow, as Amaterasu emerged from her cave, bringing light to the world not because she must, but because she chooses to, because the dance of life and laughter of existence drew her out and continues to draw her out. Every dawn, a small resurrection, every sunrise, a promise that withdrawal is not permanent, that light returns, that stories continue. In the sound of morning birds greeting that dawn, in the splash of water for morning purification, in the steam rising from the first cup of tea, the myths live and breathe and whisper their ancient wisdom. We are all connected, the divine and mundane interweave. Purity can be restored. Even gods make mistakes. Beauty fades, but meaning endures. The sea remembers, the mountains abide, the sun returns. And in that returning, in that eternal cycle of loss and restoration, destruction and creation, pollution and purification, the mythology of Japan reveals its deepest teaching. Existence itself is sacred, life itself is divine, and every moment carries the possibility of transformation, if only we have eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts open enough to recognize the gods that still walk among us, disguised as everything.